when you're doing your speech, if you'd like to move around, make sure to handle the mic as well. The timer should be on the right-hand side, so please look there. If there's ever an issue, just mention it and we'll show a different timer as well. Without further ado, to start the debate, under the motion, this House supports a global shift towards the use of domestic energy sources. To start the debate, I call the first proposition speaker. Here.
Is this audible enough? Cool. Judges ready? Starting my speech. Hold on. Yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. You create an environment in the international community where there's a global reliance on developed countries like the US, Russia, China for energy resources and call it effective development and changes towards renewable energy sources. We don't want a world where you give more room for powerful countries to prey on the lack of resources developing countries for their benefit because of the bargaining position that they have because of the reliance from these developing countries to begin with. Our path to victory is clear on twofold panels. Let's give this clear thing and characterization under our side of the House. Firstly, there's going to be lesser dependency on energy resources under our side of the House on developed and powerful countries because that's something that's inherently harmful in both sides of the House. But then secondly, better adaptation of renewable resources of energy in the international community is going to be better achieved under our side because these reliance under developed countries are not going to happen under our side of the House. With that then, let's move on to my setup before moving on to my two arguments. Let's give 3 points to crystallize this debate under side proposition. I think there's several things to note under this. Firstly, under framework, let's characterize what does domestic energy sources actually look like under our side, right? I think this can look like power plants or different energy resources. And instead of relying on exports and imports from other countries, sources come from within inside that country. So for example, Indonesia will not rely on countries like Russia or US or China. They're going to rely on their own resources and natural resources that already exist in the current status quo. But then secondly, whether non-renewable energy sources, like hydropower or solar energy, wind, biomass, electric energy, etc., that will still happen from within. But then secondly, what will the global shift actually look like under our side of the House, and why is that actually a good thing? I think 3 things to note under this. Firstly, there's going to be a normalization in the international community and in the global scale where everyone agrees with this and understands the importance. But then secondly, there's going to be likelihoods, like more exposure on the media for promotion of these things, so people actually understand why it's actually important to adapt these types of methods in the first place. Lastly, lesser or renewable and non-renewable sources from developed countries because they have the understanding of these types of things that actually already happen and they already agree upon. So note that under our side of the House, there will be high emphasis that will be made in these types of things, why there's going to be a global shift towards the use of domestic energy sources. Thirdly then, clarifications and preemptions, I want to note that opposition cannot just say that, oh, developing countries don't have resources, so they have to rely on these types of more developed countries. First, I think that this is unfair because of 2 things. Firstly, most of the current countries of these types of developing countries actually already have the 3 renewable sources that are actually already helpful towards them. For example, things like water or sunlight and wind, etc., they already have the basis of energy resources. But then secondly, note that this doesn't mean that developing countries cannot get spare parts or certain technology that are needed to advance their energy resources that they already have in the current status quo. These things will still happen as long as it is not the energy resources itself. They still can receive these things and parts to help them because this debate doesn't revolve in the impacts or imports or exports that happens outside the energy resources that are provided. With that then, 2 important arguments in my speech. First argument, why there's a necessity for this global shift of domestic energy resources. Second argument, how this actually improves the methods and development of renewable sources of energy in developing countries and why are they more likely to adapt to those types of things. But before moving on, are there any POIs? Okay, no engagement, cool. First argument then, why there's a necessity for this global shift of domestic energy resources. Let's give a clear context of the current status quo. Panels, I want to note that in the current status quo, significantly less powerful countries, like these developing countries like Indonesia or Bangladesh and things like that, rely on developed countries for their energy resources, i.e., this looks like how countries like Germany are really reliant on Russia's exports and natural gases, on oil and things like that. And when Russia is sanctioned from the whole community, they cannot export anything. That is significantly harmful towards these developing countries because they do not have any sort of these resources because they have that extreme reliance on countries like Russia. So the premise under this argument is simple, panels. We say that it will be better for developing countries because they show better independence at the global scale. They rely less on developed and powerful monopolies in the international community, and they give less room for these types of more powerful countries like developed countries to oppress them and just prey on their needs. So let's give a clear analysis under this. Why is this actually harmful, and why is there a necessity to for this global shift to happen? Why is that so important? I think there's three important things to note under this. Firstly, there's going to be things like lesser exploitation from powerful countries. If you rely on Russia for exports from them, if it runs out in the future, for example, they can just increase prices. That's going to be worse for these types of developing countries. That is something that we don't support. We don't want that to happen. We don't want these developing countries to already suffer more than they already do in the current status quo. So because it's easy for like these developed countries to just shift prices and manipulate these types of developing countries because of their reliance and because they rely heavily on of things, that's only going to harm countries that rely on them. You give no sort of tangible benefit on their side up. But then secondly, these developing countries are not going to have any sort of safety net to fall back on because they do not have any sort of resources in the first place. They do not have anything that these types of developed countries are actually giving because they don't actually know what how to do or improve these types of things. You give them no safety net to fall back on because they rely heavily on these types of things. Then thirdly, I think this is only going to be stagnant under side opposition because everyone just heavily rely on that. You don't give any sort of independence. You don't give them any sort of understanding or any incentive to actually improve their sort of energy resources that they already have, especially because these types of developing countries actually already have a lot of natural resources that they can use to their extent and for their own benefit. That is something that you don't get, right? But then second argument, how does this actually improve methods and development of renewable sources of energy? But before that, are there any POIs? Still no engagement. Let's move on to my second argument then. Let's give a clear context again. Most developing countries have natural resources, yet both sides have to concede to that. This is like oceans or landscapes or a lot of wind from different types of high places like mountains, etc. But then what are the interests of developing countries and why are we fulfilling their interests better under our side of the house? I want to know that they want sustainability, right? This means that because of the fact that they want to develop more, they don't want to stay in that position where they're already suffering. They're going to shift to more renewable sources at the end of the day because they will realize that it's more effective. And I want to know that developed countries already have a capacity and ability to adapt renewable sources, so we don't actually have to prove why they will actually do these types of things or adapt more renewable sources that will be going to be better at the end of the day. But what are the structural reasonings under this? How will we actually improve these types of methods and why is it going to be better? I think there are two important things to this. Firstly, there's going to be a belief on being more developed, meaning more effectivity and sustainability will be achieved under our side of the house. You prioritize the long-term impacts. Note that developing countries are still in the early stages, which means that there's more room for improvement than what they actually have to do in the first place. When emphasis happens, you give developing countries more understanding, which means they have more incentive to actually improve in the first place. But then secondly, this looks like more trade with other countries, and from outside of these types of energy resources, they can still rely on the parts like I've said in my preemption, because that is going to be better at the end of the day, because the problem here is the fact that they don't want, but is the fact that these types of countries do not actually have these types of things in the first place because they don't have these types of resources to begin with. For all of those reasons, you must propose.
Thank you for that speech. To open the debate on opposition, we call the first speaker of all. You're here.
A trigger warning before my speech. I will be talking about developing countries and people in poverty, and I'll try to make sure it's as sensitive as possible. Please take it with a grain of salt. For us debaters, miles away from the actual people on the ground who are suffering exactly because of the rising prices of oil and so on and so forth, we think that they cannot understand this and capture this under their side of the house when they basically said that we're just gonna let these countries not have export from these other more developed countries at the end of the day, and therefore we are so proud to propose. But firstly, then, several points of reframing and counterfactual on what our side actually looks like. We think that when we do not support this global shift, what is going to happen is that countries can choose to either generate their own resources if they do have the capacity to do that, but they can import it if those resources things that do not exist in their country, right? So it means that the kind of things that they're going to import is not like everything. They're not going to be totally dependent, but it depends on what suits the country most. We think that this kind of import will be like a 50-50 balance depending on what the country needs. And we think that this is something likely because it's already happening in status quo. And crucially then, we think that this debate is not about these already developing developing countries, exactly because they're already self-sustaining, right? So therefore they're already out of this debate. So this means that under their side of the house, these developing countries have no choice but to oblige to this global shift, because we think that the way in which this global shift works is that it's going to be catalyzed by these more developing countries by the fact that they choose to not sell their kind of products, exactly because of this trend. They want to keep all of their resources to themselves. Therefore, they do not sell it to other countries. Therefore, we think that under their side of the house, these developing countries could not get these resources to begin with, and therefore, these developing countries are the most vulnerable actors, exactly because they have no choice. But under their side of the house, their entire case that they push was just about dependency, right? But we think that, but realize that two responses to this. Firstly, we think that this is untrue, right? Because as we mechanize in our setup, we're still going to use some of our own resources in 50-50, depending on the necessity and how we're going to use it, right? And we think that there is generally an incentive for developing countries to make sure that they're starting to become more developed and more sustainable, right? Because they do have the incentive to become independent, exactly because they do not want to be so dependent on these kind of countries, and therefore, in order for them to be able to be that developed, they still need to take notes from these more developed countries and still need to take their resources until they can be self-sustainable. Like this looks like how Indonesia, who has previously just sell nickel to other countries, are now starting to make nickel factories and make sure that they could develop those nickel on their own, right? But secondly, even if it's true, I think that I'm going to prove to you as to why the harms under their side of the house is going to be even worse than this dependency that they're going to push. But moving on to my first argument then. The premise of my first argument is simple. Generating energy is not as easy as they want to posit, right? For example, the oil thingy in Indonesia. The exact reason as to why Indonesia needs to subsidize oil so much and still need to buy oil from other countries is exactly because it's not very easy to just it's not as easy as they say that the moment you have oil you could just take it from the ground. It doesn't work like that, especially because developing countries might not have the technology. But we think that export is necessary for three reasons. Because firstly, sometimes countries have different resources, right? And this clashes directly with their first argument, because their entire case basically hinges on the fact that developing countries do have resources. And we think that it was very assumptive of them to say that the moment these countries have resources, therefore they could automatically just harvest it from the ground. But we think that this is untrue, because sometimes developing countries does not have the sufficient kind of technology in order to harvest this kind of energy and so on and so forth. But even if they do have these resources, and crucially, panel, please note that it does not mean that developing countries have all the resources. Sure, they have water and wind and stuff like that, but it does not mean that they will have coal. It does not mean that they will have oil. So therefore, they need these other kinds of resources from other countries, right? But secondly, then, under quality of production, they said oh, everybody would have this technology at the end of the day, and they said we can export these energy machines. But realize that the reason why we don't do this in status quo is exactly because these machines are very, very expensive, and exactly because there is a global shift towards that kind of direction. It means that these kind of sustainable energy machines is going to be even more on demand, which means that other developing countries are going to be fighting for you to bargain and price to to developing countries to developed countries like Germany, no thank you, in order to buy these kind of resources. And therefore what happens then is that there is a scarcity of these kind of machines, which means that the prices are going to be rise even higher. But even if they can say they can make renewable energy under their side of the house, this is a very inexclusive benefit because it is not contingent on the global shift, right? It means that even in status quo, if these machines are so accessible in the very first place, developing countries would have just bought them anyways, and they would just allocate their funds towards that direction. But thirdly, then under environmental implications, not every country has the sufficient technology to harvest energy in a way that does not harm the earth, right? It means that if you force developing countries to not take any export and they have to generate it by themselves, well, then they're gonna have to make do with whatever resources that they have. It means that the way that they take these resources is likely to be unsustainable because they might not have the sufficient technology to harvest it in a sustainable way. It means that they are very likely to destroy their own lands at the end of the day. This looks like how Indonesia had to clear so many forests in order to palm oil. But what does this mean then? We think that this means two things. Firstly is that people on the ground suffer for two reasons. Because firstly of the bad quality of the energy that is produced. Exactly because you do not have the sufficient technology to harvest it, there's no guarantee that the quality of these kind of resources is going to be good. Like for example, maybe the oil that you harvest is the kind of oil that makes your car stutter when you're trying to drive it, right? But secondly, and under inaccessibility, because developing countries still struggle, and sometimes they do not even have resources to begin with. Like for example, Singapore heavily relies on their oil trade. So if you cut that under your side of the house, how will these kind of countries even be able to sustain themselves? Because they do not have the adequate resources to sustain themselves. You cannot just be assumptive and say that suddenly all developing countries have this under your side of the house. But secondly, then under increased inequality, we think that exactly because these kind of energy is going to be unequal, because the developed countries are going to be so good at harvesting their energy already, meanwhile the developing countries still need help on it, it means that development under their side of the house is slower, yes?
We never said there's not going to be any external help. We told you they can still get technology from other countries to improve the already existing resources that already happen in their end.
Yeah, we already also told you that it's not exclusive. If these countries wanted to help them to get these kind of machines in the very first place, they would have. It means that under our side of the house, we could also have these sustainable machines, right? But we think that development under their side of the house is slower. It means that there will be a disparity between the development of developing countries and developed countries. It means that under their side of the house, these kind of countries are going to be even more stagnant, and it's going to be even more difficult for these kind of countries to develop. But moving on to my second argument then. The premise of this argument is simple. We think that it's exactly because the global shift is very sudden, and it's catalyzed by powerhouses who control and do have the option to not sell their oil, it means that developing countries are likely to be unable to keep up, exactly because they do not have the resources that I have proven in my first argument. So what does this trickle down to? We think that this trickle down to two things. Firstly is economic turbulence in developing countries, because they do not have the sufficient technology to harvest this kind of oil and these kind of resources properly. It means that it is likely for them to have for these resources to be quite scarce, right? Exactly because they could not harvest so much of it. It means that under their side of the house, the prices are going to rise because there's not much of it in demand. And also sometimes the technology that developing countries have to use is not as effective. It means that the prices to harvest that oil in the very first place is more expensive. It means that the oil you're going to sell under your side of the house is highly expensive. It's inaccessible. I question as to how people under your side of the house, those poor people in the villages, would even be able to access electricity to begin with. But secondly then, we think that this causes economic turbulence in the world, because in the status quo, we think that the Middle East is very have a lot of oil, and therefore their entire economy is contingent on selling this oil. We think that if you just stop that suddenly at the end of the day, they're going to struggle in sustaining themselves, and for all those reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. To continue the debate, now I call the second speaker of the proposition team. Here.
Am I audible? Starting my speech in 3, 2, One, the current status quo is problematic. It's keeping developing countries, states underdeveloped, poor, and weak, big countries doing a monopoly and eating out the desperations of small countries, and that is what side propositions will solve in this debate. Their side of the house let all of these big countries eat upon the desperations of all these small countries and let them suffer all these times, proud to propose. 2 points of framing. First, they don't have the fiat that everything is going to be balanced under their side of the house, that it's going to be 50-50. Because when you give them the easy way out, of course they're going to be tempted to get it. Of course they're going to be tempted to take all that certain like fossil fuels from other countries. They have to give us an analysis why this can happen so that they're out of the house. And second speaker. Secondly, we can break down the whole case of oppositions while proving that one thing, which is the capacity of developing countries. Because their only rebuttal source our case is that developing countries does not have the capacity to move to renewable energy. If we prove that they have the capacity to do so, we win this debate. 1 point of flaw. I think firstly, they don't even prove the BOP in the burden of proof in this debate, which is not about domestic. They have to prove to us what in being reliance or at least being having like more relations with like resources within other countries is inherently beneficial under our side of the house. They should have defended is how they actually can have a better conditions of developing countries when you actually be reliant on all these certain things. 2 issues and 1 point of extensions. Moving on. First issue then. They talk about the rising prices of oil in the current status quo panel. But here's the thing. This happened because of 2 reasons. Firstly, it happened because of the Russian sanctions, because of all these Russian-Ukraine conflicts. But secondly, it happens because how hard it is for oil to be reached now and how it is really, really hard to find panel. Panel, I can easily flip this problem, right? Those higher prices exist exclusively under side oppositions when you don't opt into renewable energy, when you don't push these certain developing countries to opt into these certain things, right? The only reason that prices of oil exist is because all these big countries are still hiring their prices because the limitations of oil that exists on their side of the house and these big developing countries to begin with, right? But secondly, to talk about the technology to have it, things are exactly very, very expensive, right? Panel, here's the thing. Even if it is inherently expensive or whatever, I think even if it is cheap, but you don't have the incentive and there is an easy way out under their set, they're still going to opt into fossil fuels, for example. They're still going to get all of these certain things because everyone surrounding them is actually opting into fossil fuels in the very first place. No one's in surrounding them within developing countries are opting into renewable energy to begin with, right? There is no certain pressure on their side of the house for these developing countries to opt into these certain things, right? But panel, I'm just going to argue, right? I think we already told you that standing by ourselves is good because we don't have that much effect in other countries that are down for resources, for example. We don't have to get effective if Russia gets sanctions because of all these conflict that happens, right? We can be dependent toward ourselves and that is exactly good. But also, we argue that when it's likely to be renewable energy and things that are much more sustainable in and of itself, right? Relying on other oil from Russia, for example, is a short-term solution under their side of the house because it is something that can be limited later on. We will take the trade-off, even if it's going to be harder in the first few years, even if people have to suffer in the first 5 years to figure out renewable energy, we say it's inherently fine because as long as it's going to be sustainable, as long as it's going to be long-term solution, we say it's inherently fine. Even if we suffer, it's fine because later on we'll get all the benefits under our side of the house, right? But second issue then, let's talk about the capacity and also how we're going to get all these impacts, right? Firstly, they talk about how expensive it is for you to actually get technology, for example. But I'm going to argue that under our side of the house, we'll have competitions and we'll have surrounding pressures from other countries because of a few reasons. Firstly, I think pressure will exist exclusively under our side of the house when it's going to be globally shift, right? When everyone surrounding you will have the push to actually do domestic resources in a very first place. But secondly, technology will become much more cheaper when everyone is doing it and there is much more demand towards technology in the very first place. Very simple. The more demand it goes, the cheaper the prices it goes, right? Under their side of the house, the demand is very, very low. That's why technology prices is inherently higher under their side of the house, and only our side of the house actually propose to you the idea that how technology will still be accessible under our side of the house, right? But third and lastly, right, I think they talk about developing countries cannot have still the capacity to do so, right? But we already told you and clarify, right? Even if it's going to be hard, it's going to be fine, and it's going to be long-term, but also how this will actually affect how relations with other countries and trading with other countries will actually help and benefits them in the long-term under our side of the house. Is there any POI before moving on to my extension? No? Okay. Starting on with my extensions. How does incentivize developing countries to improve and maximizing their potentials? We have competition between improvements of resources, right? And this is different with Val's case about shifting to renewable energy. My extension will push how developing countries are much more likely to tap into an untapped market in current status quo, but how does this look like? Firstly, I think in the current status quo, Indonesia is reliant on many resources on outside. Although our natural resources is inherently enough, the reason for that is that how then you like the lack of technology constrains them from improving. Look at multiple different and new energy resources like the heat of wave currently having in like Sumatera, for example, or so many other things in certain parts of Indonesia oceans when there is a certain potential, but there isn't any push for them to actually use this potential in the very first place, right? Secondly, note that most of this is exclusive in Indonesia because how big our ocean is, for example, and this is exclusive and untapped market in the very first place. The only reason for us to push government to develop is to make them be in a position where it is the only option that you have, where they have to use and develop it, which is shifting it to domestic sources of energy and side propositions. But thirdly, so this is how we can maximize the capacity of developing countries because most of them are still like shifting to like natural and not our high bidding, for example. Many of them still have ocean, many of them still have trees, for example, and any other things. So what are the impacts? Firstly, I think when we use and develop it more, then they have the upper hand to be solely dependent on themselves and actually be more improved as a whole. And this is the only chance for developing countries to actually have the first time to have a first like starting point and a better starting point in terms of comparison with other developed countries, for example. But second, they save up more money because they don't have to like buy resources in market handled by rich developing countries that can easily be monopolized, right? Because big countries does not care about you. Big countries doesn't really have the incentive to make it accessible for you, so they have to later on explain to them why then all these big countries will actually make like all those resources cheaper for you in comparison with just creating your own renewable energy in the very first place. But thirdly, I think this gives a good image for like developing countries in the very first place in terms of how then they get a better view in and of itself. Hence, they get more trust from other like developed countries or even other developing countries surrounding them. Other countries that are more incentive to do more relations with them, do we have a better diplomacy relations, political relations, or even economical relations, and we think that is exactly beneficial. What is the link back within this extension, right? I think we push them to maximize and develop, push, and this is actually exclusive because because this is the only way for them to actually develop by actually you pushing them and forcing them to actually develop on their own. What is the certain like thing that we already said and why we win this debate, right? Firstly, I think we proved to you how then these developing countries do have the capacity to do so by explaining how then cheaper prices will actually happen and how then the push of other countries surrounding them will actually exist under our side of the house. But secondly, we also proved to you how then actually making renewable energy is a way for you to have a good view and a better relations within the certain economical or even like diplomatic and also political relations with other countries, right? Here's the win this debate. Firstly, I think in terms of we already proved to you how do we have more sustainable solutions when we actually push them, even if they have to suffer in the next 5 years. We say it's inherently fine because at least they're going to develop by their own and don't have to be dependent in the very first place, right? In comparison to their side of the house is that it's a short-term solution when you rely on all these like huge fossil fuels from Russia, for example, and then once Russia gets sanctions, you get more higher prices, right? They cannot have any guarantee that later on this is going to be cheaper for them or it's not going to be limited for them. Later on, the second speaker has a big burden to prove to how then sustainability and long-term solutions can exist under their side of the house and how then they don't still need to do so. And for all those reasons, Jabar win this debate.
Thank you for that. The debate, call upon the second opposition speaker. Here.
Check. Check. Panels realize how the proposition team never actually take consideration of what is happening in the status quo. Realize how people in the society can actually function normally because they simply have access to whatever energy they need. They can go here and there because they have BBM. They can actually afford BBM. They can still have cars. They can still mobilize everywhere because they have the source of energy that they need to mobilize. So in this case, like responding to what the previous speaker has spoken, the claim about like saying that this proposal is actually okay, it's okay day for people to suffer, it's only gonna be like 2 years. I believe that this is not true. This is irrelevant because first, this is gonna take such a long time. The suffering would take such a long time because at the end of the day, technology is going to like slowly, technology supply is going to be slow, especially in the developing country where you have like really low resources, and also like people aren't going to be familiar with it, considering that this is a global shift, and they don't have the guarantee that the developing country would actually have the incentive and also the to actually maximize the use of this technology itself. So even though have the technology, and even though that their claim is saying that they're gonna like suffer from only like for 1 or 2 years, it's still going to take such a long time. It's going to make them suffer for such a long time. Well, but even if it is okay, even if it is actually only 1 until 2 years, I think the benefit won't be sustainable as well, because since the government actually put these people into suffering, they would actually be met with the government itself. Like government would receive a lot of backlash, which can't be risked, especially when you actually want your people to trust you with your renewable energy kind of. But moving on to my point about dependency, we believe that in the end of the day, developing country is never really that dependent anyway in the first place, because it is actually not happening. Countries will just logically, developing countries will actually still use their local energies, and they will actually opt into something that they need to import when it's actually really urgent. So their claim about it is not a fiat, it is like clearly in the status quo and stuff like that. Countries will opt into like support or other countries when it is actually emergency only, because they know it is probably going not to be ideal. There is going to take a lot of money. It's going to be like so costly when they're actually really poor, and when they can actually exploit on their own resources, why not do that instead? So naturally they would actually minimize it. So yeah. So the thing about them saying that there's no urgency and about dependency itself, I think that their claim and their concerns about this is not really urgent at all, because actually there's actually no significant harm in the status quo itself. Basically, it's basically what is happening all the time. Export and import is basically happening all the time, and nothing is like really urgent about that. But to my extensions. So here's the thing. This proposal is actually harming a lot of countries, and also especially developed and also developing countries in the first place. Why is it so? So first, we have to notice that not every country has a good management. They can't actually guarantee the good usage of the resource itself, and by that, and not because they don't want to be good in managing it, but but when global shift happen, there's a lot of unfamiliar things happening, a lot of unreadiness and stuff. It is unlikely that they will be able to like import anything, because other country won't actually gonna sell it. For instance, when we as the developing country want to import from a developed country, the developed country has the capability to actually opt in to their local resources, but we still need them. No, thank you. So like in the end of the day, it's actually not because it's actually the global shift that actually would actually harms the needs of each country itself. And to develop what they need, they would need to have a good management, and they would need to be stable at first in the end of the day. And their mechanism about they would agree upon this policy is probably happening and manifesting in a bad way, because it is happening. They probably agree upon this policy, but they never prove how these developing countries actually have the resource, the technology, and also the readiness and capability to actually do this. So yeah, yes, okay, maybe in developed country they are going to survive with their local resources. The people still can eat and stuff, but this actually harms another stakeholders too. For example, like imagine the companies who relies on importing and also global trade. Imagine the countries whose value actually relies heavily on their energy supply to the world. For example, like how Saudi Arabia is a really big supplier of oil in the world. It is actually affecting the developed country too, and I believe that this is really harmful to developed country, and also like what is happening, and also the economic chain in the developed country itself. So what about developing country? We believe their claim about developing country can actually handle this is really irrelevant, because we have proved to you how Indonesia is so rich of resources, yet we still import here and there. But this is actually because the use of energy is so, no thank you. This is actually because the use of energy is really various. In the end of the day, it's so various around the world and also around the country. Why is it so? Here's the thing. Some countries might need less oil because they don't need it as much for the industry. They won't need it as much to function. They don't need they don't really need the oil because they actually had, or maybe in the worst case, they don't really need oil because in the end of the day, we feel like they just basically don't have resource of oil itself in the first place. So, but for some country, they have like really high demand on oil because they need to like build trains, for example. Maybe there are like a lot of industrial production houses in there. Maybe there's a lot of aviation procedures, or also like aviation industry in there. Maybe this is the thing that by that we actually prove to you how actually the demand of resource and also like the capacity of the country to actually handle resource and also like like demand and supply for resource is actually very case by case in each country. Yeah. And this is why we believe that by those differences, that these different demands and also like interests can be powered with only local resources, and that's why they seek for help. Some countries have high demography where people and they have like more people to fulfill the needs with. So by the end of the day, there's a lot of another urgency that is not catered by the propositions team. So yeah, even though that they have a lot of resources, they would still need to import at some point. They would still need to ask for help or something because finally, like they have like no, thank you. So like yeah, basically like that's basically what is happening around the world. You seek for help because you can't really handle it by yourself anymore. But in developing country, they have limited resources, so many things to power with the resources. With the shock of this global shift, the management won't and not yet proven to be efficient. But moving on, what is actually harming in this? What is actually happening in the harm side? So developing countries and for developing countries and also civilians, this is really not fair. Because why? First, these energy are going to be managed under a bad condition. How is it so? Countries, especially developing countries where it is not stable yet, they don't have good resources and stuff, countries will find it hard to provide for people. Countries will actually but with all of those struggles, they would still have to make sure that it is affordable for those people. But it is actually really impossible because the cost is they just don't have the capability to, like exploit the technology and stuff. They maybe don't have the resource that they can manage until the end of the day. So it'll be very hard for the country to provide because they're gonna lose so much money subsidizing and stuff like that. And even if it is, even if they actually succeed, the price will really rise up. It is going to be expensive and is really not accessible for people in the ground, especially for the middle to lower class people. Even if you do have the technology, you can import from others. When you don't have the resources and the sufficient management, in the end of the day, the resource won't be sustainable, and and the suffering that you put your civilians into, your citizens into, is not going to be worth it because in the end of the day, you lose your trust as a government, you fail as a government. By that, we oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that speech. Now to anticipative part of proposition case, we call the third prop speaker. Here.
All right, I'll start in three. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Look, if side oppositions wants developing countries to be independent and to use renewable resources, then their side actually supports this global shift because that is what our side actually does, right, at the end of the day. Now then, I would like to point out the contradiction on their side. Opposition's first speaker said that developing countries have no choice and that they have to import energy. However, opposition's second speaker later then said that developing countries aren't that reliant on other countries and they have their own like energy resources. I'll deal with both of these cases on my first clash and why our side is still better in both of these scenarios. Side opposition can't just take a half stance in this debate and then expect to win. Now then, 2 clashes in my speech. Firstly, the dependency and sustainability, and my second clash on whether developing countries can actually adapt to this shift. Now then, onto my first clash on dependency and sustainability. What are their claims then? They said that, developing countries would have no other choices and they have to keep importing. First, several responses to this. First of all, note that in the long run, it is actually side opposition that will give these developing countries no choices because panels, we know that non-renewable energies by their own definition cannot be renewable, cannot be sustained. So for example, on their side, if they rely on Russia for like these natural gases, future, maybe like 100 years or like 200 years in the future, these natural gases will become so scarce. And at the end of the day, these developing countries who rely on these non-renewable resources and have to import them will have to pay higher prices because these non-renewable resources will become more and more scarce, and the countries that own this can just skyrocket the prices. And under their side, these developing countries have no other choices but then to keep importing this at very high prices, right? Secondly, know that under our side, we actually cater to these developing countries. Under our side, these developing countries are just going to be better off in the long run for reasons. First of all, note that under our side, these developing countries will be more likely to shift to do these renewable resources. Look, we think that there's actually two types of these developing countries in the status quo. The first type is that those developing countries that actually rely on other countries to export their non-renewable resources, right? Under our side, these developing countries will realize that, oh, they can't just rely on other countries for their energy due to this shift. These countries will then opt for a more and a more long-term solution. Look, under side opposition, they will just encourage dependency culture where countries are just reliant on one another for their own energy. Like, for example, this would look like the Germany being reliant on Russia for their natural gases, for their oil. Germany, who have like built two pipes connecting to Russia and another pipe that would cost billions that is currently under construction to allow these natural gases to flow through before like the Russia-Ukraine war started. However, look what happens when the war actually started. Germany had to sanction Russia, and what happened is that this country ended up having like the crisis of energy scarcity, and the prices of things such as like petrol have skyrocketed in Germany, often like doubling or even tripling in price. Panels, what does this example actually show you then? It tells you that when you rely on another country for something so crucial and so necessary like energy, this isn't sustainable and this is not a reliable method. Panels, you can never know for sure if like another country will just start a conflict or if another country will just run out of their own non-renewable energy resources. Panels, the only country that you can actually rely on is your own, and that is what our side actually advocates for at the end of the day. Now then, the second type of developing countries, those developing countries that would still rely on non-renewable energy resources. Those developing countries that still rely on things like, for example, coal and natural gases. So, why does our side actually cater to these types of developing countries at the end of the day? Because under our side, sooner or later, these developing countries will soon realize that their method isn't sustainable. So for example, like if a country uses their own coal resources, this country will know that, oh, maybe like 20 or 30 years in the future, our coal reserve will run out, right? Under our side opposition though, these developing countries can just import from another country and then escape their own responsibilities. And I've explained to you before why this is actually harmful. However, under our side, these developing countries have to be responsible for their own energy problems. So under our side, when these developing countries can just import energy and thus realize that, oh, like maybe 20 years in the future, our country will run out of our coal reserves, then these developing countries under our side will shift to more renewable energy resources such as like solar power, wind energy, hydroelectric, etc. I already told you I'll take that later. Look, panels, most countries would have access to at least like one of these three main types of energies. Like for example, a country may be windy, sunny, have a lot of rivers that is flowing downstreams from mountains, etc. So under our side, we would actually push these developing countries to shift for these new renewable resources, right? So panels, what does this clash actually tell you? It tells you that under our side, these developing countries will shift to more renewable resources as they can't just rely on other countries. It tells you that these developing countries won't get stuck on a dependency culture, like for example, Germany and Russia. And it tells you on side opposition that in the long run, the prices of this new non-renewable energy will skyrocket. And if these developing countries keep relying on it, they will at the end of the day just have to pay more and more prices, and this isn't sustainable. Before I move on to my second clash, can I take that POI?
Happening in the status quo, but like when assuming that renewable energy is still happening in the status quo, but people still export and import some sources of energy, how does it feel? How does it make renewable energy more exclusive in your side of the house? Because it's also likely in our side of the house. Thank you.
Look, you gave the example of importing and exporting. Under our side, we advocate for these countries to be independent. That means they have to rely on their own domestic resources. So that means under our side, there will be less imports and exports. And under our side, these countries will have to rely on their own energy. And when they actually do this, they realize that they have to depend on renewable energy because at the end of the day, if these countries rely on non-renewable energy, it isn't sustainable, right? Secondly then, on my second clash on whether developing countries can actually adapt to this shift. What are their claims? They claim that, oh, developing countries don't have like the sufficient technology, and even if they do import, like this technology will be very expensive due to increased demands for this. Several responses to this. panels, know that more demand doesn't always mean higher prices. For example, this is like when demand increases, so does the supply of this. So for example, panels in the like current status quo, technology is just becoming more and more in demand, and this would incentivize more businesses and more companies to actually invest in these technologies. This is very evident when you just take a look at the example of like how many more Apple or Samsung store there are now compared to like 10 years ago. Look, the same thing will happen when there's more demand for this technology that can contribute to renewable resources. Like for example, if you take a technology to build a hydro dam, and this is more demand on our side, there will be more companies and more business that is actually going to be more incentivized to produce this specific technology because more developing countries would actually want this, right? Secondly, then, even if the cost of like this new technology are suddenly very high, which is just unlikely to happen, know that on the long run, side opposition would just spend so much more money when they would actually just import this energy every day, right? Look, under our side, maybe these developing countries have to spend like X amount of money on a one-time purchase, but on their side, these developing countries have to keep importing this resource, and at the end of the day, and in the long run, this cost on their side would just be higher than the cost on our side. Look, under our side, even if like the government in the worst case scenario cannot afford this, then they can at least still borrow from like the World Bank or like under etc. And this is just going to lead to more sustainable development at the end of the day, right? Look, in the worst case, we think that if these developing countries has to go in there for like maybe 3 to 5 years, this is preferable than what is going to happen on their side, because on their side, when these non-renewable resources are going to be less and less sustainable and more scarce, what happened on their side is that it is likely that on their side, these developing countries will go in depth in the future because they cannot just rely on imports, as we have already proven to you why these non-renewable resources will skyrocket in price and will just be at the end of the day. Because of all of these reasons, then vote for side proposition.
Thank you for that speech. Now to end the substantive part of the debate, I call the third opposition speaker. Here.
Tess. Short warning because this is recorded, so I hope that the things I will be saying should not be taken out of context. It's for the sake of competitive debate only. To force countries who can't even sustain themselves to walk on a fiery coal road to make them stronger is not development and will never be. Saying that countries have, oceans and trees and all those kind of things doesn't equate to an actual analysis as to how all those things equates to actual capability to implement these things, and that is exactly their path of failure. Don't by assumption
by actual protection, and that is what we give under side proposition. Several things I'll be talking about in my speech. Firstly, on why the developing countries and developed countries dynamic that they love so much is worsened under side proposition, and secondly, I'm going to compare the mechanisms that exist under both sides of the House. But before anything, several notes on framing that I just want to get rid of very quickly because their case quite weird. The first thing to note on is how PM's entire case was quite self-defeating. I don't really need to rebut because they did it for themselves in the same speech. The entire preemption was to say that developing countries do have resources like wind and water, which is actually quite ludicrous framing as well, because they never inherently engage to the actual crucial resources such as oil that countries in fact do not have in a uniform spread, because oil, have geographical aspects or prerequisites that have to be fulfilled by countries that was necessarily not engaged at all. This is not a cherry farm, so let's not pick it. But secondly then, one of the main link for their argument was to say that people or like countries do have resources in the first place, so do pick a stance. I'm not quite sure on what they're trying to get on. But second thing that I just want to get rid of is on incentives and on renewable technologies. I think all those things can be easily addressed by the fact that this is not exclusively a byproduct of having, the global shift of, those things under their side of the House. Insofar as countries would have the incentive to want to compete, they would want to have the incentive to survive and to compete with other countries, to be developed, to be rich, and to be able to alleviate the people on the ground. So insofar as that competition still happens, it is unclear as to why that competition doesn't exist under our side of the House, and therefore renewable technologies and renewable technologies and the incentives to probably make better technologies would still exist. But additionally, I'd say that, in terms of renewable technology, society is progressive anyways. Climate change is a real problem that has to be enacted by every people on the ground because it is something that impacts every single person on the ground. Therefore, I think that the government would have the incentives to want to make renewable energy. You can see the manifestation of this, like how in Saudi Arabia made renewable technology, and Jokowi even in Indonesia, which is relatively a developing countries, would opt into a more the renewable energy and opt into green energy. So those claims on incentives and renewable technologies inherently was out and was irrelevant. Okay, on to my first clash then, on the developing countries and developed countries dynamic, and why is it worsened under side proposition. Actually, I'll take it right now.
Why is oil a resource and more important to developing countries when you compare it to things like energy, with energy that's more sustainable?
Yeah, because you need oil for everything, that's one. But secondly, oil is more scarce insofar as not every country have it, and that's why it's important, because if you don't have oil, then your inherent benefit doesn't stand. On to my first clash then. The main premise that they told you under the entire developed countries and developing countries dynamic was to say that there is reliance, and therefore, it opens up the potentiality of them to price gouge and all these kind of things. Realize how this is not true insofar as it is not that simple that, the countries would just rise up the price just because, you want to buy oil from them. We told you how it's probably even more moderate. Insofar as, countries are legitimate stakeholders, I think that they can review these options in the first place. If it's so abusive as they proclaim them to be, then they simply won't just opt in. This was inherently a weird characterization coming from proposition and inherently dismissive. But second reason as to why this is not true, I think that, competition between countries also exists, insofar as they would probably want other countries to buy the resources from them anyways, and therefore, due to that sort of incentives to compete with other countries, I think that price gouging is not that's likely to happen, insofar as instead they would probably try to moderate or sort of regulate this sort of amount so that the people would opt into this in the first place. I think that additionally, price gouging is sort of problematic, and therefore, because countries are subjected to things such as scrutiny, I'm not sure as to why that is likely in the first place. And I think that even if that is likely, countries could always have the options to opt into other stakeholders and other countries as well, so that inherently false. But the second thing that I'd like to engage on is on their weird idea of sustainability. Basically, their entire case is that, you are sort of left it out right now, but in 2 or 3 years, you can probably sort of catch out. Realize how there's literally no likelihood as to why this is true in the first place, because I told you that the second that you are inherently left out, you will never inherently want to catch up with the countries, or you will never be able to inherently catch up to the countries, because as you are left out, every country would be inherently dynamic, and they would be inherently pushing for further development and all these kind of things. The second that you are left out, you are left behind forever, and that is something that they never inherently engage with under their side of the House. How should you weigh this then? If you compare this to under our side of the House, when we do not inherently force developing countries to inherently mature when they are immature, they will eventually become more sustainable after their techs develop, and would probably opt into these technologies the second that they are capable, because they have the incentive, and because when they do have the capability, and therefore when they do actually have the incentive that can be co-opted. But proposition said that these countries just want the easy way out. We already told you why they would want to develop in the first place, unless, somehow weirdly countries want to be poor under their side of the house, and like people's reaction wouldn't necessarily matter, because I posit that people would necessarily give backlash to the government, all these kind of things, and that's inherently bad because the government is legitimate, and therefore it backlashes the entire government system and things. I'm not sure why countries want to be poor, and I think that intuitively everyone knows that this is not true. Everyone wants development, everyone wants upliftment, and all these kind of things, and therefore their sustainability doesn't inherently stand. But we realized then, WIP sort of gave this weird analysis as to why, these countries can just opt into things such as IMF or World Bank or something. If they push for things such as Reliant, I'm not sure why they push for this, because this is sort of reliant in a way, in some sort of way. But I think that on the point of reliance, I think that there's also already incentive. If there's profit, they will obviously want to produce it by themselves, because why would they want to depend on other countries? But just because there's already rise of sustainable energy under our side of the house, is progressing that way, and it's better if we do not force them, but rather let them to inherently review these options by themselves. On to my second point then, on mechanism comparison. The pushback on their side of the house was to say that you're going to get technological spare parts on their side of the house. Several things to note under this. Firstly, that literally tells you nothing. Sure, you have spare parts of technology, but you don't have the energy resources at the first place. So what will you inherently process under their side of the house? What you will get is literally nothing, right? Because all you get is those spare parts technology, and that's the weird logical gap that they never bothered to take into account, and this is never resolved. Too late for them to do on the reply. But on the flip side, then I'd like to just outline that all we needed to prove here was why their side's harm inherently outweighs all the benefits, or why the harms this is happening. Or all instances. And what we told you here was simple. Firstly, you subject poor countries that don't necessarily have their own energy resources, or have extremely limited energy resources. For instance, Singapore, probably, even though they are very tech, they're very good in tech and all these kind of things, they do not have, they have very limited natural resources, for instance. Those type of countries will inherently collapse under their side of the house, and they never approved as to why that is inherently okay, and that's a net harm. Insofar as when the country is effective, the people on the ground are also harmed, and the people also die. But secondly, then, this will trickle down to the people underground, exactly because we already told you how prices would be extremely high if you want to have this in the first place, because when you push these countries to be more mature when they are not immature, this is going to push for bad qualities. So at the end of the day, it's going to be bad quality. It's going to be very pricey under their side of the house. But what happens under our side of the house? To just double down on the win, right? Under our side of the house, countries would still rely on their natural resources, but it will cost them less because they have the incentive, because why would countries want to depend to other countries when they can inherently fulfill it? I think that this is not a fiat, because this is something that exists under status quo. They cannot just start. On to my final way up then. At worst, if we are super, super, super reliant, so be it, right? At least on our side of the house, we don't have, people literally flocking on the streets and damning themselves and dying because the government just choose to be a FOMO, and the government choose to just opt into those things that doesn't necessarily help them. Under our side of the house, we give protection and we save the people for reasons. So proud to stand in opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Now to summarize the debate. First, from opposition, I call the up reply. Here.
Tess. So many minutes into this debate, and Proposition's case is nothing short of a slander to the very actors that they wanted to protect. The moment that they conceded that when they are waiting for this renewable energy to develop, those peoples under their side of the house is going to suffer, it means that they conceded that all of the harms that we posit under their side of the house is true. It means that all people are going to suffer, are going to die, they're going to be in the streets hungry exactly because they do not have enough money to buy these energy and oil on their house. So proud to to oppose. Two clashes in this debate. Firstly, under capability, and secondly, under sustainability. Firstly, under capability. What we told you then was that it is these countries are not going to be very capable in handling these type of global shifts. Exactly for two reasons. Because firstly, then the types of resources that a country has is very variative and different. It is exactly why export needs to happen in the very first place, because you need to trade resources with other people in order to make sure that all of the resources in your country are fulfilled, right? That is what I told you under my speech. But what I told you otherwise is that some countries do not have resources. Like, sure, they have water and oceans and stuff like that, but that does not equate to the actual type of energy that they need. That, like, our cars are not powered by water right now; they are powered by oil, right? And therefore, under their side of the house, basically, none of their benefits still stand if they cannot deal with this kind of harm. But we also told you then what this will impact to is a significant price rise, right? Because this type of energy is so difficult to harvest, therefore the prices are going to rise. It is going to be inaccessible, and people cannot access it at the end of the day. What they gave you was just no engagement. And all they said to you, like, oh, it's okay to let them suffer for 1 or 2 years because at the end of the day, it's going to be sustainable. But we already proved to you why it's not going to be a short term of suffering, because renewable energy development takes a very long time, as my second speaker has told you, right? But realize that what my third speaker told you was that even if at the end of the day this kind of development happens anyways, you're going to be so far left behind to the point that you are no longer able to catch up, and all of the people in your country is already suffering and living below poverty gap. The way in here is simple. Under their side of the house, these people have no choice, right? They have no choice but to opt into this kind of forced maturity, and therefore under their side of the house, these people are not ready. But meanwhile, under our side of the house, when we wait for them to ready, they could still choose to buy resources from other countries, but it still means that they can still use their own resources under our side of the house. So they could adapt it based on their necessity. But secondly, then under sustainability, we already told you why there's incentive under our side of the house for renewable technology and independency, right? From my first speech, I've already told you that countries are generally trying to become more independent, exactly because they don't want to be dependent on other countries, because then they will have to spend so much money, right? But under their side of the house, all they told you was that, okay, sure, these countries are going to have incentive, but they never even proved to you the capability. So the only thing that you're doing under your side of the house is just telling these countries that they have no other option, therefore they have to mature now, and they never even bother to explain to you the mechanism of how these renewable energy service parts will even happen under their side of the house. They just said, like, oh, these things are going to exist, but we've already co-opted that. We've already told you that if those things are so accessible in the very first place, and if those countries want to sell these cheap tech parts for so cheap under their side of the house, then it will happen under our side of the house as well. It means that under our side of the house, there's no likelihood as to why we cannot co-opt that benefit, and as to why we cannot also have renewable energy under our side of the house. So the difference is, under their side of the house, sure, there's an incentive, but they never prove on the capability of why that incentive is likely to manifest. Meanwhile, under our side of the house, we prove to you why these countries are still going to have incentive, exactly because of the competition and all of the independency that they want, as my third speaker have told you. But under our side of the house, what we provide, and this is exclusive, is that we provide them with the capability that we will sustain them, that we will let them export from other countries to the point until they are able to sustain themselves when their technology are ready and mature enough to develop and ready enough to sustain themselves. But at the end of the day, we've already bit the bullet and conceded that even if sustainability doesn't happen under our house, at the very least, then it's okay, because at the very least we will people dying on the streets like under your side of the house. At least accessibility is still achieved under our side of the house. If you want protection, vote for opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Now to summarize the debate from proposition and end the debate as a whole, I call the prop reply. Here.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Developed countries that have a global dominance in the international community feeds only on the desperation of resources of developing countries. It is only a global tyranny that they're allowing under their side to checked and unregulated in society. They cannot say developed countries are the only solution and also say that developing countries' resources are already sustainable. debate won't even happen in the first place if that's the case. If that's the case, then it's clear that proposition wins. If they want protection, they cannot even push for a world where dependency culture exists and you allow developed countries to exploit these types of less powerful countries under your side. Strategic mistakes then. Firstly, I want to know that they don't even have the fiat to say that it's going to be 50-50 under their side of the house, where developing countries use their own resources and still rely on the more developed countries, right? That's incredibly stance panel. You cannot buy that. Up to end of this debate, they never even actually proved to you why their stance is actually exclusive. Because if all countries are already using local resources, that is uncharitable. You have to either defend more resources from outside or domestic energy resources. Pick what you want to defend. You can't just push something that's already half stance. But then secondly, they never proved their burden of proof, right? They never actually. This is not a debate about just the domestic scale, but why is it actually likely for developed countries under their side to always have the best intentions, and why they won't just pull out and increase the prices when resources will become more scarce at the end of the day. But I also want to note that the fact that they gave minimal engagement and no POIs in my PM and DPM speech, they agree with our points. But then two clashes. First, on the necessity of this global shift. Second clash on how is it going to be better for adaptation for renewable sources of energy, which side achieves that better. First clash on the necessity of this global shift then. Two justifications under our side of the house, under our case. We say that the dependency on developed countries is harmful for two important reasons. One, there's going to be more room for exploitation. Two, you give developing countries no safety net, and that becomes stagnant because they won't develop anything anyway, and they cannot rely on that. But then note, their only response to this was that developed countries still have incentives to always help because they want renewable energy sources anyway to be adapted in the international scale, which is not even exclusive to begin with. They never proved to you why it's likely to happen. But in their case, right, these types of, they told you that developed countries are the only solution. No, they never proved to you why this is the case when they themselves say that these types of developing countries are actually going to just rely on these developed more. But then they also talked about how oil is not going to exist under our side of the house, and that is the most important thing in their case. I want to know that their case that comes from in third is actually just self-defeating and have her own case by saying oil is the most important resources, while first and second propose renewable energy sources also. Panels, I want to know that oil will run out anyway. When they only focus to that, their world is still dying at the end of the day. But then secondly, I think it's an easy way out for these developed countries because there's no push for an alternative that is more effective from the international scale or community. Because everyone under their side is going to do these types of things. They heavily depend on monopolies that have larger bargaining power than them. So if they say that we will suffer for 5 years, their case, these individuals still suffer for 100 decades when oil fuels run out, and there's no alternative. It's clear which one wins this clash. But then second clash then, on the better adaptation of renewable sources of energy. What did we tell you? We told you that developing countries actually have more incentive because they want effectivity and development. That is what their interests are. But also we told you under our second speaker's extension on the point of opting to untapped market that Indonesia has multiple different potential resources like ocean, wind, forest, in which developed countries with high buildings doesn't. But then the result is that developing countries can finally have an upper hand and better starting point than a developed country to begin with. But then I want to know that their case is not enough because firstly, the only way for you to achieve a greater push is for all parties to understand the importance. But then secondly, prices are really high because there's less demand under their side on the technology to improve these existing natural resources to begin with. For all of those reasons, it's clear that Jabar wins.
Thank you for that speech. That marks the end of the quarterfinals round. Congratulations for both teams for putting on a truly great debate for us to watch this morning. For all the teams, you can cross floor, shake hands, and leave the room. Wait in the main hall until we make the announcements later on. Thank you.
Sejak 1960, kami berupaya memberikan kontribusi bagi bangsa dalam membangun dan mencerdaskan melalui pendidikan. Universitas Ahmad Dahlan menjadi pilihan utama mewujudkan cita-cita. Setiap tahun, tak kurang dari 7.000 mahasiswa baru dari dalam dan luar negeri bergabung bersama kami. Dengan inovasi, teknologi, dan kreativitas, serta dilandasi integritas intelektual dan integritas moral yang dijiwai nilai-nilai Islam, kami ciptakan suasana belajar yang nyaman dan menyenangkan. Kepercayaan masyarakat kepada kami dibuktikan dengan meningkatnya jumlah mahasiswa baru dari tahun ke tahun. Saat ini, lebih dari 26.000 mahasiswa aktif yang berasal dari berbagai wilayah di tanah air. Upaya internasionalisasi terus kami lakukan, ditunjukkan dengan adanya sebaran mahasiswa asing dari mancanegara. Iklim prestasi yang dibangun di lingkungan kampus mendukung mahasiswa terbaik dalam berkompetisi di berbagai kejuaraan, baik tingkat nasional maupun internasional. Kami memberikan bekal pengalaman kepada mahasiswa untuk mengikuti berbagai program kerjasama internasional dalam bentuk joint degree, double degree, short course, summer camp, dan program-program kompetisi pada level internasional. Sebagai perguruan tinggi Muhammadiyah, kami menjadikan Al-Islam dan Kemuhammadiyahan sebagai landasan bagi seluruh kehidupan kampus. Pembelajaran menyenangkan dengan beragam aktivitas untuk mengembangkan potensi bakat dan minat yang dimiliki mahasiswa. Organisasi kemahasiswaan yang lengkap serta 3 organisasi otonom Muhammadiyah menjadi pilihan terbaik bagi mahasiswa dalam menyalurkan minat dan bakat baik di bidang akademik maupun non-akademik. Seiring dengan perkembangan teknologi yang semakin pesat, fasilitas jaringan internet kami tingkatkan untuk kemudahan dalam proses pembelajaran e-learning, berbagai transaksi pembayaran, dan perkuliahan. Kami memiliki smart room yang dapat mengintegrasikan semua sistem informasi manajemen kampus yang ditampilkan pada dashboard eksekutif sistem, sehingga dapat mempercepat pengambilan keputusan dan layanan pada dosen, tenaga kependidikan, mahasiswa, dan orang tua yang semakin cepat dan optimal. Selain itu, kami juga dapat melakukan analisis media sosial, teleconference, maupun online meeting. Lebih dari 750 tenaga pengajar berkompeten yang memiliki kualifikasi terbaik di bidangnya. Sejak 2017, kami memperoleh akreditasi A Institusi oleh Badan Akreditasi Nasional Perguruan Tinggi atau BANPT. Selain itu, berbagai capaian lainnya telah berhasil kami raih. Kami berupaya dalam memberikan pendidikan berkualitas dengan sistem pembelajaran terbaik kepada mahasiswa. Kini, kami memiliki 11 fakultas dan 52 program studi, baik sarjana maupun pascasarjana. Fasilitas yang lengkap, pelayanan yang ramah, tenaga pengajar yang profesional menjadi hal utama bagi kami. Ruang perkuliahan yang nyaman, laboratorium terpadu, amphitheatrium dengan fasilitas 3D dan smart presentation, observatorium, serta perpustakaan yang lengkap sebagai penunjang kegiatan belajar mahasiswa. Pendidikan, penelitian, dan pengabdian kepada masyarakat menjadi tugas utama bagi perguruan tinggi. Di bidang penelitian, kami berupaya menciptakan iklim penelitian yang semakin baik dan kondusif serta menyenangkan. Penelitian para dosen terus mengalami peningkatan dengan berbagai inovasi yang dikembangkan dan memberikan manfaat kepada masyarakat melalui penerapan berbagai hasil penelitian seperti teknologi tepat guna. Target luaran publikasi ilmiah dalam bentuk buku, publikasi pada jurnal nasional terakreditasi maupun jurnal internasional bereputasi terus-menerus mengalami kenaikan yang signifikan. 78 jurnal yang dimiliki di berbagai bidang keilmuan, 33 jurnal yang terakreditasi Sinta, 3 diantaranya terindeks Scopus, dan hal ini menempatkan UAD sebagai perguruan tinggi Muhammadiyah pertama dan satu-satunya yang memiliki 3 jurnal internasional bereputasi terindeks Scopus. Tidak hanya itu, pada bidang pengabdian kepada masyarakat, mendapatkan pengakuan yang membanggakan, yakni dari klaster sangat memuaskan menjadi klaster unggul. Kami membangun jejaring yang kuat dengan berbagai lembaga, instansi, dan perguruan tinggi, dibuktikan dengan adanya berbagai rekam jejak kerjasama nasional maupun internasional. Kerjasama yang dijalin mencangkup kegiatan-kegiatan bidang pendidikan, penelitian, dan pengabdian kepada masyarakat yang diwujudkan dalam bentuk seminar, workshop, publikasi, dan berbagai program lainnya. Kami menjalin kerjasama multi-years dengan Erasmus Plus Uni Eropa melalui program Capacity Building for Higher Education dalam pengembangan bidang kewirausahaan dan disaster management. Alumni merupakan aset berharga bagi perguruan tinggi. Untuk itu, kami senantiasa terus meningkatkan kualitas lulusan. Untuk mengetahui kompetensi lulusan di dunia kerja, kami melakukan research study dengan memaksimalkan partisipasi para alumni melalui Kamada, Keluarga Alumni Universitas Ahmad Dahlan. Sebagai pengembangan ekonomi bisnis berbasis pengetahuan, kami memiliki unit-unit usaha, di antaranya PT Adi Multi Energi, PT Adi Multi Kalibrasi, PT BPRS Carana Kiat Andalas, PT Adi Multi Husada, PT Adi Multi Teknologi, PT Adi Multi Properti, PT Adi Multi Boga, dan PT Adi Multimedia. Siapkah kamu menjadi salah satu bagian dari kampus penggerak peradaban Islam berkemajuan? Kampus impianmu di masa depan yang menjadikanmu generasi muda berkarakter unggul. Universitas Ahmad Dahlan adalah kampus impianmu untuk mengembangkan diri, bertumbuh dengan karakter unggul dalam menciptakan ide-ide terbaru. Pembelajaran menyenangkan akan kamu dapatkan, seraya dengan nilai.
Salah pilih cinta boleh, tapi jangan salah pilih obat ya.
Syahadat makatul mukarramah antoron ghazirah tiwala lailil khamis hatta sobatil jum'ah asdarul markazul watoni lil arsodi tahdiron min halati toksi fi mantikoti makatul mukarramah. Pagi Mbak, boleh saya periksa dulu ya?
Iya dok.
Oke, jadi yang dikeluhin apa Mbak?
Saya masih pusing dok.
Pusing banget ya? Oke,
Iya.
Terus untuk lukanya gimana? Masih sakit nggak?
Masih sedikit nyut-nyutan.
Oh, masih sedikit nyut-nyutan. Terus ini kemarin kok bisa kecelakaan? Gimana Mbak kecelakaannya?
Jadi sebenarnya saya yang salah dok.
Oh,
Baik, hari ini sidang kami anggap cukup, maka sidang hari ini kami tutup.
Gimana?
Oke.
Oke, cut. Bungkus.
telah Tuhan berikan kepada bangsa Indonesia. Anugerah lebih dari 53 juta generasi belia yang kini sedang duduk belajar di semua jenjang dan jalur pendidikan. Jika seluruh potensi bakat dan talentanya kita rawat, kita asuh, dan kita merdekakan untuk tumbuh, berkembang, dan menjadi inspirasi Indonesia Emas 2045. Kenali dan merawat semua potensi keunggulan anak bangsa. Itu adalah menjadi tanggung jawab kita bersama. Mentransformasi potensi keunikan bakat alami, gifted, menjadi potensi aktual, talented. Kita lakukan melalui berbagai ajang talenta. Kita hadirkan ruang pembuktian diri bagi para belia untuk belajar menjadi generasi berpengalaman, berpengetahuan dan kuat dalam penciptaan di bidang sains teknologi, seni dan budaya, vokasi, kewirausahaan, dan olahraga. Kita menolak untuk menyerah. Kondisi pandemi yang menghadirkan segala keterbatasan ruang dan sumber daya tidak menyurutkan kita semua untuk terus menghadirkan berbagai ruang pengalaman dan penciptaan itu. Kita fokus dalam menjaga berbagai ruang itu tetap hidup, penuh semangat berprestasi melalui upaya adaptasi masif. Memigrasi semua ajang talenta menjadi berbasis online dan hybrid sejak tahun 2020. Pada tahun 2022, kita menyelenggarakan total ajang talenta untuk tingkat nasional berjumlah 43. Pada babak penyisihan, 18 ajang dilakukan secara hybrid dan daring. Pada babak final, 1 ajang dilakukan secara hybrid, 28 ajang secara daring, dan 14 ajang secara luring. Sebanyak 197.068 peserta didik telah menjadi perwakilan satuan pendidikan untuk mengikuti ajang talenta yang diselenggarakan Puspresnas BPTI. Pada tahun ini, kita delegasikan 207 peserta didik pada 19 ajang talenta di 14 negara. Mereka mampu meraih 226 medali dan penghargaan internasional di bidang sains, teknologi, robotika, penelitian ilmiah, seni budaya, debat bahasa Inggris, keterampilan, dan olahraga. Yang sangat membanggakan, pada tahun ini juga kita menyaksikan bagaimana ruang-ruang penciptaan kreatif dan inovatif di segala bidang begitu tumbuh. Hasil karya talenta muda di bidang penelitian ilmiah, karya seni budaya, literasi, bisnis dan kewirausahaan di semua jenjang terangkum sebanyak 45.437 karya pada tingkat provinsi dan 5.387 karya pada tingkat nasional. Bahkan pada tahun ini telah diciptakan lebih dari 769 karya cipta lagu di jenjang SMA dan SMK. Kita tentu saja tidak hanya ingin berhenti sampai pada kompetisi. Manajemen Talenta Nasional mengamanatkan pengembangan ekosistem akuisisi dari kapitalisasi talenta, sekaligus pemberian penghargaan dan insentif yang lebih luas kepada peserta didik berprestasi. Kebijakan Merdeka Belajar episode 10 adalah komitmen kuat kita untuk memberikan fasilitas karir belajar bagi peserta didik yang diwujudkan dalam program Beasiswa Indonesia Maju atau BIM. Beasiswa Indonesia Maju menjamin karir belajar talenta berprestasi, menciptakan talenta-talenta kelas dunia untuk membangun sektor prioritas negara di tahun 2045. Kini BIM telah diberikan kepada lebih dari 600 peserta didik di jenjang S1 dan S2, baik di dalam maupun luar negeri. 171 diantaranya sedang menempuh studi S1 di perguruan tinggi utama dunia di Amerika Serikat, Kanada, Eropa, Singapura, dan Australia. Mereka berasal dari program persiapan S1 luar negeri Pusat Prestasi Nasional. Pemberian insentif dan penghargaan tidak hanya diberikan untuk para peserta didik,
tetapi juga untuk satuan pendidikan yang berprestasi agar terciptanya pelembagaan dan pembudayaan prestasi di tingkat satuan pendidikan. Sejak tahun 2021 telah diberikan skema BOS kinerja kepada 207 sekolah dengan kriteria sekolah berprestasi. Pada tahun 2023, BOS prestasi telah dirancang untuk diberikan kepada sekitar 2.745 sekolah. Kita juga terus berupaya untuk menjadi bagian dari implementasi kebijakan manajemen talenta nasional di bidang sains, seni budaya, dan olahraga. Berbagai program pengembangan identifikasi, penyediaan database, dan pemetaan talenta melalui pengamanan sistem informasi manajemen talenta peserta didik kita terus dikembangkan secara sinergis sehingga pengelolaan talenta unggul Indonesia dapat dilakukan secara lebih efektif dan berkelanjutan. Tata kelola, kebijakan, dan program kita terus diupayakan melalui upaya pelembagaan yang lebih kuat dalam bentuk pengembangan standar penyelenggaraan ajang talenta. Pengembangan layanan melalui pembentukan Balai Pengembangan Talenta Indonesia atau BPTI. Penguatan dan perluasan dengan 78 mitra strategis. Pengelolaan komunikasi media yang diharapkan dapat lebih mendekatkan layanan kepada peserta didik dan masyarakat. Media sosial Puspresnas menjangkau keseluruhan wilayah provinsi di Indonesia. Peningkatan jumlah pengikut terus bertambah dengan audiens yang sesuai target sasaran meraih interaksi yang tinggi. Pusat Prestasi Nasional dan Balai Pengembangan Talenta Indonesia menjadi bagian yang sangat kuat dari semangat untuk bergerak mewujudkan Merdeka Belajar yang merawat dan mengasuh potensi talenta berprestasi untuk menjadi inspirasi keunggulan Ibu Pertiwi.
and also speaker roles for Sumatera Utara. Okay. For Jawa Barat. Jawa Barat.
I'm speaking first.
Yeah, who are you?
Valerin.
Valerin.
Rafa is speaking second, and third is Declan.
Who will do the reply speech? Who will do the reply speech?
I will do the Valerin.
Just a reminder that this is a live stream room, so if you want to offer POI, please make sure that you utilize your mic. For all the observer, please make sure that you maintain the quorum. Make sure that you are staying while the debate happens. If you want to go out, please do in between speeches, and don't be distractive. That's it. We're still waiting for one more judges. So yeah, just quick introductions. I'm Balkis. I'm going to be your chair for today. Judging with me will be other, like 4 panelists. Maybe Gio, you can start introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm Gio from DKI Jakarta. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Icha from West Nusa Tenggara. Best of luck.
Hi, I'm Matthew from Riau. Good luck to everyone.
We're still waiting for one more judges, so yeah, please wait. Sorry for this. Perfect. Welcome to the semifinalists of Nsdc 2023. Yeah, so Utara will be a panel for today's sessions. Without further ado, we would like to welcome the Prime Minister from the government side, side of the House. You may have the floor here. Boleh nggak pendekin mic-nya? Just checking, is the timer visible? Prime Minister? PM, is the timer visible?
It is very visible.
Okay.
Time and time again, social movements have been ignored by governments all around the world. People who these social movements support have been failed by the systems that the government has put in place. Any policies that are made are done at a snail's pace or implemented improperly. The marginalized then are rarely catered to in most places around the world. Proposition side thinks it is time for something more direct. Rather than meshing with the systems that are already in place, we would insert ourselves into them. 4 pieces of framing at the top of my speech. Firstly, is on the mechanism here. I think our mechanism is quite simple. We'll just send more representatives from the social movements to be able to talk and to liaison with government officials and to tell them what the social movement wants, what we stand for, and why we want that, and hopefully convince them to be able to do something. And then 2, we just want to highlight what the difference is between lobbying and judicial review just from a general perspective. The first is that we think lobbying attacks the core of the issue more than necessarily when representative to be able to talk and engage in discussion, that you're more likely to be able to hit the core of the issue. In comparison, judicial review is more indirect. That's simply pointing out that a law is wrong and that a review must be made without saying exactly then what we hope to achieve from this kind of review. But then 2 is that judicial review necessarily is still done by bureaucrats. And the problem with that is that we think inherently bureaucracy is resistant to change, especially when that change goes against what the government agenda is. And this is often the case for many social movements around the world that are fighting against the systems and the systemic oppression that is in place. And then 3, on note on the motion, 2 things. First is that it's a prioritized motion. So I think we think on both sides, lobbying and judicial review will exist. It's just the difference would be the amount and the prioritization of it. But yeah. 2 is that this House believes that means that this should be quite a principle debate. We're not saying practical, it's not going to be important. But our main burden is then to justify to you why social movements should opt in for more lobbying compared to judicial review. Finally then, we just want to give you a little bit of characterization of social movements. 1, we think the goal of social movements is to incite change and policies that can benefit their agenda and the people on the ground that they're trying to support, i.e. Black Lives Matter is trying to change policies that can so that they can benefit black people, for example. And then 2, that the characterization of social movements necessarily means that they are protecting vulnerable actors, and these are actors that are worth to be protected, and therefore we think that the government should have the duty to protect them, and yet we see that is not the case in status quo. That's why we have to take matters into our own hands. First, substantive then, on the justification for why lobbying should be prioritized. The premise here is that we think in status quo, it's hard for social movements to get policies to be made under judicial review. 3 points here. First is that we think that necessarily when you have little support from the masses, as is the case for a lot of social movements, which try to posit sometimes controversial topics that the public might not agree with, it's less likely to be accepted under judicial review because the government only wants to cater to the majority and not necessarily the woes of the minorities. But the difference then with lobbying is that movements are directly involved and can keep reminding them that, hey, this is something that we advocate for and you should push as well. Two is that judicial review is indirect, as we told you at the start. But what this means in this case is that it doesn't have the same urgency than direct lobbying, i.e., I as a government official am going to be more influenced and more moved by somebody going up to me and telling me, hey, I think there's a problem here, here's how we should fix it, rather than giving me a piece of paper saying that we have a complaint about this here policy, we think you should change it, but I was never told how to do that, and then I still have to get that paper and submit it to somewhere else, and probably I'm not the last in the line to enact that kind of policy change, right? We think that necessarily then judicial review is a more indirect system that requires more hurdles to be passed before policy can be made. But then three, we think judicial review is a system open to mostly everyone. And therefore, a social movement that does put its problems on a judicial review system is less likely to be highlighted, right? That politicians are swamped with various other requests for judicial reviews, that your request that you want to stand for your social movement might not necessarily be so highlighted in their minds. And this is important because we need to prove that the judicial review system would be more likely to fail compared to lobbying. So then why is lobbying so good? 4 reasons. First is that because the movement directly engages and reminds bureaucrats, this means that bureaucrats can't necessarily forget that, for example, a request was made to review this kind of law, as is so often the case in status quo and in just very simply customer service, for example, when you make a complaint and then it's just forgotten because it has to go through so many steps, right? 2 is that we think that lobbying is more exclusive, that politicians are not as swamped with lobbying, primarily because now they are reserving time for personal time between your representative and the politician means that it is more highlighted and more fresh in their minds. 3 is that possible solution ideas are given directly with lobbying, i.e. that the social movement thinks of possible solutions for this kind of problem and immediately proposes it to the politician instead of waiting for them to make changes on their own. And then 4, we think that in status quo, companies and other influential actors lobby all of the time, right? And sometimes it's even for policies that are against social movements. So then they need to prove, so at least for social movements, they advocate for the rights of those who are vulnerable and not, for example, for the rights of a massive conglomerate. They need to prove to you then why then when social movements lobby, it is exclusively bad, or rather it is not going to be effective when companies and other influential actors have used it all the time and it is shown to be effective. Before I move on to my second substantive, any POI? Okay, I'll move on. Second substantive then, on more practical side, how it helps of social movements. 2 premises here is that first, we already explained to you that lobbying necessarily creates more urgency for bureaucrats and government officials to be able to consider it, but moreover then that it makes your movement more valid in the eyes of those government officials when it is a real person that is meeting them. 2 is that since you meet government officials directly, then you are likely to be able to talk with them and to build up a relationship with them. So then we think that this leads to 3 impacts. The first is that there's more net policies on our side of the house when you prioritize lobbying, and this means that more policies that benefit those who are marginalized are going to be made, or at least you get more representation within the government on our side of the house when you can sway these people who are important to your side. While their side would choose to wait for the slow turning of bureaucracy when it has shown that in status quo, bureaucracy has failed these people time and time again. And then second impact then, we think that this can create connections within the government, right? That when you sway someone to be on your side, that they have more power to be able to attract other people to be on your side as well. I.e., I as a government official am going to be more easily swayed when I know my friend supports this social movement and he explains to me why he advocates for this social movement instead of a piece of paper given to me or something that I read on the news, which is much more indirect. Therefore, then the comparative is that because on their side, they have less personal meetings between these people, they necessarily have less connections, kind of curbs the power that social movements can have in status quo. Third impact then is that we think that this can actually create trust, or rather buy-in, from members of the social movement, but also from people who are not involved in the social movement. Why do we think so? It's because the act of lobbying is probably seen as a more frontal approach compared to trying to fit in with the system, i.e. judicial review. What this shows to the people is that the problem is really that urgent, that it really is that bad, that you need to take such a direct approach to solving it. When necessarily means that people are going to be more likely to believe that your cause is actually for something and something worth fighting for, which means more buy-in, and that social movement can get more power to be able to lobby and to influence the government to make more policies that can benefit them. And why do we think this is important? Is that we prove that lobbying has benefits compared to judicial review, but moreover, that because of the nature of this social movement, that lobbying and that new policies will necessarily benefit the most vulnerable on our side of the house. For all of those reasons, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. I would like to welcome Leader of Opposition. You may have the floor here.
Is this audible enough? Okay, thanks. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Black Lives Matter, feminist movement, Stop Asian Hate, and other social justice movements that exist in the current status. What do they have in common? Panels, they strive for solutions of the injustices that occur for the existing parties involved in the current status quo, the parties that they are actually advocating for in the current status quo. Proposition cannot debate in a world where they expect all social justice movements to have the same bargaining power as all existing parties, like the government, at the same all of those other more powerful social justice movements that actually exist. You're meddling with the government under side proposition. You give more room for them to criticize you directly. You don't achieve any sort of change at the end of the day for all of these social justice movements. You cannot just expect governments to listen at all if these types of social justice movements already have like a really high bargaining power to begin with. With that, then let's engage on their points clearly, right? Let's flip their claims. Proposition wants two things in their first case. Firstly, they want social justice movements to get more awareness. Secondly, they want a direct form of solution that will be for all existing parties in the current status quo. I think there's several why they won't achieve this. Why is it going to be worse under their side at the end of the day? Firstly, I just want to clarify that lobbying is actually something that is based on radicalism. It is likely that social justice movements to adapt radical forms of activism because they need to grab the attention of the government. They need something big enough that is really appealing to the people and to catch the eyes of the government at the end of the day, because of the government is still the most powerful party existing in the current status quo. You cannot just do some sort of like asking them for like things like to agree with you and negotiate with you. They won't even participate to begin with. You need something that will catch their eyes. That is something that opposition and proposition will actually do under their side of the house. But I also want to note that under our side, we can still push for different types of solutions, and it's even going to be more effective at the end of the day because you're actually doing this in a form of legal system. This will be legally embedded in the current status quo at the end of the day. Proposition cannot just say that we won't have any sort of alternative under our side of the house. Incredibly unfair. But then secondly, awareness and support is actually not going to be achieved under their side because receive much more criticisms for your movement. You're going to be labeled as somebody who defies the government informally and hate on them and like not have any sort of like legal system or like legal solution towards that. That is not going to be good for like the image of these social justice movements at the end of the day. But then thirdly, lobbying is not direct. I just want to get that thing. If anything, it's even more indirect in the legal system and like doing the things like judicial reviews, because at the very least, you're going around all parties the current status quo, you invade their privacies. No one is going to actually overrule or give sort of checks and balances that will exist to make sure that nothing actually goes wrong within that sort of process. But then I want to frame lobbying, right? What does it actually look like and why is it actually bad? I want to know that this requires government attention, which becomes contingent on the idea that they do it and make it radical in the first place, which means that they're going to be more likely to exaggerate different types of things. Social justice movements can even go into these people's personal lives of certain actors existing in the current status quo, who they are, what they do behind, etc., or like even turn to things like different things like violence, like bombing places or riots, because they actually need to gain the attention of these governments in the first place for you to lobby them in the first place. Then what will judicial reviews actually look like? I think this will look like court and law proceedings. And I want to note that the court is actually more powerful in the current status quo. If you bring it into court and it's deemed outside of the legal system, that is something that will be better achieved. You achieve better solutions under our side of the house at the end of the day. With that, then let's move on to my two fundamental arguments in this speech. First argument, why is it in principle this is actually in line with the interests of social justice movements. I think there's 3 layers under this. But then second argument, why this actually allows more effective form of legislation. Why is awareness better under our side of the house, which directly clashes with their points. First argument then, on the principle, why is in line with the interests of social justice movements. There's 3 layers under this argument. Let's give a clear context of the current status quo panels. Note that the social justice movements that exist in the current status quo advocates for specific issues that they already advocate for. For example, feminism pushes for more rights on women, more opportunities, to fight wages gap that actually exists in the current status quo. They fight for their reproductive rights, i.e. Roe v. Wade and things like that, or food insecurity, for climate change issues, etc. But what are the interests of the social justice movements? Let's clearly characterize that in the current status quo. I think there's 3 important things to note under this. First, they want to advocate for change for all the issues that they actually are striving for all the different parties that are oppressed, for example. But then secondly, fairness and equality, right? Then thirdly, they actually want to cater to parties like minorities, which means that at the end of the day, they want some sort of change. They want tangible impacts and actions to be done to solve these types of issues to begin with. So what is the premise under this argument? We think that social justice movements has interest that's going to be better for society and actors that they advocate for. If you go to the legal side and aspect of this type of in this debate, there's going to be more tangible impacts at the end of the day. But let's give a clear analysis, third layer in this argument. Why is it actually harmful to begin with? I think it's harder for you to lobby the government because it's contingent on 3 important things that they have yet to prove under their side. Firstly, there's going to be bargaining position between social justice movements and the members of the governmental bodies or officials. The power of these social justice movements, I want to note panels, that is based on the voice of the people. It depends who actually who participate in these types of movements, who are actually advocating inside from within and things like that. So if these social justice movements do not have any sort of support to begin with, they have lack of support, if they actually also agree to that, if, for example, they consist of the minority, they cannot appeal. At the end of the day, nothing is still achieved anyway. But then secondly, let's give a clear framing on the issue on subjectivity vs objectivity. I want to know that lobbying is based on the idea that these social justice movements actually wants. They support their own self-centered interests, unlikely for people to be objectively judged, that because no legal body has the power to oversee that, it's going to be much worse under their side of the house. But then thirdly, there's going to be an assumption that government is actually going to cooperate and listen. Social justice movements, lobbying is for their own interest. Judicial reviews is based on the legal system and laws. You actually implement some sort of legal rights and policies that are going to be better formed under our side of the house at the end of the day. Let's move on to my second argument then. Why does it allow a more effective form of legislative change? How are you going to achieve better awareness? I want to know that awareness is a rational underside proposition because it's going to be extremely exaggerated, it's going to be radical, and it's going to be forms like violence and things like that, which is actually going to be worse. We think that it's going to be better for social justice movements under our side of the house because it's going to be aligned with the legal principles and a legalized form of solution. So the premise under this argument is simple. We're doing it in a civilized manner where there's clear legal proceedings are going to achieve a more tangible impact at the end of the day. But what are the structural reasonings? Why is it actually better for the social justice movements and the government system and the society as a whole? Firstly, I think awareness is better achieved because there's going to be things like media coverage and judicial reviews. There's going to be updates on these types of proceedings. In comparison, when you lobby, it's going to be just private meetings that people don't have an update on or a clear knowledge on. There's not much checks and balances that exist anyway. But then secondly, we're willing to make the trade-off here. At least under our side of the house, there's going to be more emphasis on what the legal system is going to be better sustained. We argue on the idea of utilitarianism, right? At the very least, it's going to cater better to the people. It's going to be catered better to the majority because these are legal rights that everyone are actually experiencing in the current status quo. You change policies more effectively under our side of the house, it is what matters. But what are the impacts at the end of the day? What is the conclusion of my speech? Firstly, I want to know that trust is worse on social justice movements under side proposition because they're deemed as radical. Secondly, awareness is better achieved because there's going to be other forms of ways to actually get more attention in the current status quo under our side of the house. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you, LO, for that speech. I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister from the government side of the House. Here.
How do I? Ya. Boleh mundur dikit? Okay. Check. All right. The opposition side is highly dismissive of our characterization and is highly dismissive of our case. And we as the proposition side will prove to you exactly why proposition has already won since the first speaker is changed. So let us engage with some of the cases from the opposition side then. Number one, they claim that we cannot expect the social justice movement to have bargaining power, and this is something that the opposition side holds a lot of contempt over. However, we believe that even if we do not have the bargaining power, at the very, very worst case, we can at least get at least one member to be swayed over to our side. And that one member, when swayed to our side, it can at least lead to sparks within the lawmaking scene or whatever, and make us a trailblazer and further our social movements. And this has already disproven what their point of contention is. Secondly, they claim that somehow lobbying invades privacy. However, mind you, we have never, ever have we said that we will ever invade privacy. Lobbying, we are forming connections such as lobbying over dinner, over games of golf. When has that ever count as invading privacy? As that is a question that we raise towards the opposition side, and it's a burden that they have to prove and engage on. Third of all, they claim that somehow lobbying is indirect. However, my Prime Minister has already clearly characterized to you that lobbying is, and in fact, an even more direct and a more frontal approach towards this to gain the changes in legislation. If anything, their side is the one that has a more indirect approach towards this kind of situation, where they rely on a bureaucracy to pass the message through a medium, which I will prove to you why it is ineffective. Fourthly, they claim and highly champion that the court is more powerful in the status quo. However, we from our first speaker, we have already proven to you that the court is still relying on a bureaucracy and is dismissive, and this is dismissive towards the Prime Minister's characterization. From the Prime Ministers, we have already characterized that the bureaucracy is slow, ineffective, and lazy. Sometimes the complaints and the cases that they appeal towards the lawmakers, it can get lost within the administration, and we cannot guarantee that the case that they propose can even get to the lawmaker in the first place. Fifthly, then, what I have an issue with the opposition, they claim that lobbying is ineffective because of some reasons. Number one, we lack bargaining power, and number two, it depends on the voice of the people. However, the bargaining power one doesn't even really hold a lot in this debate, as I have already rebutted before. And secondly, on how it depends on the voice of people. We already have that as the social justice movement. As the social justice movement, of course, it serves the interest of the people, and therefore, a lot of people will be supporting the social justice movement as well, right? Therefore, we already have the voices of the people on our side. So I don't see why the opposition claims this to be a reason why lobbying is ineffective on our side. Sixth, they claim that the social movements are self-centered and therefore ineffective in lobbying. However, this is at best a symmetrical harm on both sides, because even if you do pursue the legal way as they frame it, it is still self-centered either way. So this is something that the opposition cannot claim as well. Having said that, let me move on to my substantives. Let us, the proposition, characterize to you first why the government needs the social movement in order to clarify this debate. First of all, social movements are seen as an hindrance, something that blocks their views. This makes the government hate and hold contempt for social movements. Number two, government lacks knowledge and information about the social movements. Number three, government ignores and neglects social movements because they see them as rebels and troublemakers. And I, as the deputy today, will prove to you why the proposition can effectively negate all those reasons and prove to you why lobbying is better in achieving legislative change. Yes, I will take that PY.
Why is one government official that will side with you enough for change to happen? What about the bad image that social justice movements are going to be attacked with because of radicalism to lobby? We don't think that lobbying is radicalized because we are privately making connections towards the lawmakers. So I don't really understand why the opposition keeps on claiming that we will still have the bad image. Then, moving on then, why our side is more likely to garner legislative change? Number one, social movements want change and they want to make their cause clear. When we take into account the precedented ignorance and neglect the government has expressed and our weak and pacifist ways are extinguished, it is time for the social movements to take a more direct approach if they want to have a shot at being heard and if they want to make an actual change. In lobbying, the social movements will still be harder to ignore since the information is directly presented and they are being forced to face the truth and they have to digest this information face to face. First of all, then, face-to-face interaction is much more powerful than words. With face-to-face interaction, you will naturally be more persuasive and actually humanized and tangible. And that is something that humans like lawmakers can actually connect with. With that in mind, the connection that the social movements have with the lawmakers infinitely boosts their chance, as the lawmakers will be more likely to pay attention to your case and therefore garner legislative change in the end. With that in mind, this connection benefit that is exclusive to our side directly addresses one of the main reasons why the government neglect legislative alteration for the social movements. By connection, we gradually yet strongly introduce the information and social movements goal in a more palatable way. Opposition cannot claim that the judicial review is also a palatable way, as I will disprove soon. So then, by lobbying, we provide and educate the information to the lawmakers, and we also negate their content and bad prejudices against the social movements. Because through connection, we humanize the social movements. And the lawmakers are like, oh, these social movements aren't so bad at all. So then this effectively negates one of the bad images point that the opposition tries to use against us. So then, by lobbying, we provide and educate the information, and we also we influence the government to be quietly and unknowingly, and this is based on trust, which is a precedent towards legislative change. Secondly then, in comparison to judicial review, where the exclusive human connection is lost, the lawmakers will not prioritize you. They will not be incentivized to even look or even glance over to your case. You are just another complaint file amongst the pile. Your case will get drowned out and fall into obscurity. Opposition side is very dependent on the bureaucracy that has been infamous for being very slow and incompetent, and it does not guarantee that any legislative change at all, and their case doesn't even get submitted. If the case isn't even submitted, how can it garner any real legislative change? This is a question we raise towards the opposition side. Even in the best case scenario, where the case does somehow get approved and gets through the process, it is very counterproductive. Number one, the process is slow and therefore the attention and the legislative change will be slower to materialize. Number two, there is no guarantee that the case get approved and processed correctly. The government officials against the social movements that work in the bureaucracy could be very well have easily be corrupted and maybe even left the case in the dust and suppress the case to be even noticed. Third of all, even when the case does get approved and get to the lawmakers, as characterized, there is no guarantee or at least the likelihood that the case will even be considered or appealing to the lawmakers enough to actually make a change in the legislation. So, judges, this is how you should weigh our cases. Proposition side opts for a more frontal case in reaction to ignorance and neglect. Through lobbying that can forcibly and open their minds and make them be more open-minded towards our social movement, our likelihood is higher and the turnout result is way better than the opposition side. While the opposition side chooses a very meek and pacifist way to garner legislative change, even though it has been proven time and time again that the government does not care. If you really do want legislative change for these social movements, vote for proposition side. I am very proud to have proposed.
Thank you for that speech. I would like to welcome DLO. You may have the floor. Here.
Am I audible? Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proposition wish, expect and play in La La Land that lobbying is just literally dinner with one of the electorates in the scenario. The biggest question that proposition never answered is how do we even have a direct dinner or connections with all of these high politicians to begin with? Because not a via to guarantee that success anyway, they have to explain that later on in their whip. A few points of framing. Firstly, let's frame lobbying panel. It's not having dinner or lunch, and this is the correct characterizations under oppositions. Panel, lobbying is shouting all over social media and saying that the government is wrong, the government did something wrong, and we have to change something, right? But if it's easy to have dinner with Nadiem Makarim or Jokowi, for example, we would have done that in the current status quo, for example. The problem why lobbying or judicial review even exists is because the lack of attention that exists in the current status quo. You cannot just ask for dinner, for example. You have to create that attention to have the direct connections to begin with. Radicalism is still existing on their side of the house. They have to later on defend why on their side of the house suddenly connections can increase on their side when social movement individuals is not someone with big bargaining power, is not someone that is actually holding a lot of power within like a certain nation, for example. That's their missing point. But if you still don't buy that, then here's the one contradiction. PM said they want to do something frontal. DPM said they want to have a deep connections with these certain people, which is what is their side actually proposing. They want to be something frontal or they want to be some deep connections within the government system, for example. It is something still questionable. A few points of flaw. Firstly, PM plays in a utopic world that, the history of problems change it when you are not even a credible actor and your complaints is mostly subjective or against the legal principle to begin with. That's why you don't do judicial review, for example. You don't align with UUD, for example. I understand it's a fiat for them to do that, to have a certain prioritizations, but all the benefits is two best case anyway, and how you're going to suddenly win is not something that they have actually proven in this debate, right? Their whole case fallen if they cannot even prove the likelihood of direct connections with with like a certain politician, for example, if they cannot prove that Jabar win this debate. First issue then, I'm going to talk about the idea of likelihood, right? Firstly, they talk about more representative to talk to government. We say it's going to be harder to talk for government for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you have to have a strong connections with a government system, for example, or you have to have a huge bargaining power to begin with. If you're not having to do radical things to attract attentions in their side of the house, but thirdly, there is no way talking one face to face suddenly can change everything. One dinner is not going to change the whole legality of a certain nations under their side of the house. It's two best case under their side. They have to engage with the worst case scenario, right? But secondly, let's talk about the judicial review. I'm going to argue that this is they said that it's not enough. We say it's for a reason why it's still going to be more than enough under our side of the house and side oppositions. Firstly, panel in the status quo, may not be enough because of how then it is not prioritized under our side of the house. They did not push more legal principle or did not push to do these certain things. They're too focused on awareness all the time to raise awareness towards society. Panel, this might sound harsh, but in the status quo, social movement has many views from society already. What we need is not the trust from people, but more trust from the government, and it is what side oppositions will achieve under our side. Thirdly, in the world of propositions, you do frontal radical stuff that makes your government doesn't even like you anyway, that thinks that you're too much and you're something that is oppositional towards him, right? You have to explain to me why then someone that is oppositional suddenly going to be accepted by the government in and of itself. But fourth and lastly, only in side proposition you justify government to attack frontally back to you because you do it first to them. In side oppositions, we point out inconsistency of their actions within the legal principle, which is more justified to begin with, and that's a review nicely, not something that is frontal or something that attacks them directly in and of itself. Moving to second clash then, about the further impacts, right? They said lobby exclusive because you give direct solutions under their side of the house to responses. Firstly, no, this is not even exclusive because we also do that because the reason why then we want a review, there's a problem that needs to be solved, and one of the ways is to change these certain policies, for example, true proving legal principles is not being aligned with. But second, we say it's even better under our side when you give a concrete evidence that they are wrong, that they're inconsistent, to actually make them believe that there actually needs to change something. Even if it's something that is liberal or new, you can still find a legal principle talking about equal rights, for example, talking about equality for people and fairness for all people. We said it is still accessible under our side. They have to defend that and whip later on. But let's talk about the one member believing is inherently good because that's their main case under side propositions. Here's the thing, panel. One member is not enough. There is no that one member within a certain political society will suddenly go against 50 other people within the parliament, right? They care about their image as one of that member, and they don't want to ruin their certain jobs and ruin their certain background, for example, just because they want to follow the social movements in and of itself. At least under their side of the house, they have to prove more than 50% of people and the parliament will suddenly support them, which is not something that is even likely to happen under their side of the house because they only rely on one person and one person only. They understand this debate, right? But lastly, right, easier backlash, there's two things. Firstly, I think government works under the basis of law and regulations. Like in Indonesia, we have UUD, for example. We implement and create policies under that basis of legal principle. But second, in the world of opposition, we incentivize them by proving there is an inconsistency within their actions in the first place, that they are not following their legal principle, that they are for the decades. They have to prove later on in their side of the house why then something that is again a legal principle needs to still be adhered under their side of the house, needs to still be changed under their side of the house, which is still a missing bullet under their side of the house. I'll take the PR now.
Is something like posting on social media to make change. That's something that's very obvious, right? That's very tense with your LO's characterization of lobbying being something that is hidden behind doors.
I think lobbying still exists in social media when you just literally just like post something that is talking badly about the government, for example. They just still do radicalism by proving that, oh, this government is inherently bad because they did A, B, C, for example. I think lobbying is not just about go protest, for example, that you hurt a certain facilities, for example, but how you talk badly about the government on social media, for example. And this is something that we don't want to defend under our side of the house. Moving into my extension, right? I think I'm just going to argue a better result under our side of the house, right? But there's 2 points. Firstly, radicalism, even at the expense of more views or more support, is going to be inherently bad. There's 2 reasons. First, I think lobbying needs attention for government to actually happen, to actually have a connections with the government. This means that they have to do something big to attract the government attention, to actually have that meeting and to actually change. Hence, radicalism is a prerequisite under their side of the house. They have to prove later on why it won't be a prerequisite thing under their side of the house. But second, when you have and hope for legislative changes, doing radical needs to be enough. PM also conceded that they're going to do something that is more frontal anyway, so they agree with us. Panel, frontal radicalism never government preference in the very first place. We want to be heard. We have to talk slowly, not shout in front of their faces and tell that they are wrong and they're dumb and they're stupid. But secondly, how do you have better policies and will be created under our side inside opposition, right? I think firstly, I think policies that got accepted as policy that is greater and policy that is good, right? I think under our side, courts needs to be immediately implemented under our side of the house. When it's something that's actually agreed upon in court, it's going to be suddenly changing the policies. But under their side of the house, they're lobbying one person that needs to suddenly ask other people to join the certain opinion, for example. It takes longer time under their side of the house to actually prove all these certain things to actually be correct in the very first place, right? They're telling one person and dreaming for a miracle to happen under their side of the house and expecting 50% of the parliament to suddenly support them under their side of the house. Panel, even in the time efficiency of social movements, we have better things when you have a judicial review that is directly going to change the policies, not just wishing on one certain individuals to suddenly change the whole parliament and suddenly change the whole political and judicial societal things under their side of the house. We're not paying in the best case scenario, right? But even if it does bring awareness under their side of the house, it's not guaranteed and it's going to be good, right? But also the biggest actor that you should be able to persuade is the most important actor is the government itself and not just thinking about society, for example. Awareness is already a lot, panel. You have and befriending with like a certain government, for example, not just lobby upon them and say that they are frontally dumb and stupid, and for all those reasons, please vote for opposition.
Thank you for that speech. I would like to welcome the third speaker from the government side of the House, Government Whip. You may have the floor. Here.
Check. Am I audible? Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1.
opposition side of the house keep being dismissive on this debate and keep attacking our side of the house without even like telling us how exactly their side will look like. So, 2 points. Firstly, the first speaker of the opposition side told you that that lobbying is being done privately, so that like other people have less access and it will not be known by other people or etc. Right? But secondly, then the DLO told you that lobbying is like a form that is very frontal. For example, like hate comments and etc. on the social medias and etc. Right? This is just a we think that this is just a backlash because these 2 points already a different definitions, right? But beforehand, 3 points. Firstly, onto the rebuttals. Secondly, onto the first clash, which sides in more beneficials in aiming the change of the policies. Second clash is then on which side it's more important, either on the reputations or the change, right? Firstly, then onto my rebuttals. 1 point. Firstly, they told you that bargaining power is unlikely on our side, but we question how likely is it going that among the people that supporting the movement, and not even one of them have a semblance of the bargaining power, right? Besides, lobbying can all be done through the ways that does not need like a bargaining power. For example, go to the office and like making the appointment and directly presenting of such stuff, right? But if their side really does keep insisting that lobbying is radical and publicly be done on the social media, we think that it is still not that bad, right? And the oppositions then indirectly admitted that lobbying is indeed better and getting the attentions and garnering the government's attentions, right? Moving on to the first clash, on which sides is more beneficial than in aiming the change of the policies, right? But they claim to you one thing. They claim to you that a social justice movement is drive based on the voice of the people, so that if lobbying, if there is no support of the people towards this lobbying movement, etc., it is also not that impactful, onto changing those regulations, right? But they don't realize at the first place why the social justice movement exists at the first place. It is based on the people's voice at the first place, but it is not voiced out. So that's why social justice movement exists at the first place, in order to help those people voice out, right? But in our side, we also already told you 2 things. Firstly, on government's prioritization. Government's prioritization is actually not necessarily on those submissions or etc. Right? Realize at the first place, we as the societies is already like unlikely to be heard as the first place, right? So we think like by the paper submissions or etc. It's kind of soft approach that is slightly neglected by the government sides, right? So government sides, right? And that we think that lobbying is like a form of a straightforward attacks for the government's official. So in our side, we will likely to get the obvious attention, and that's why in our side it is more likely to get into their circumstances in order to get their attentions, right? So, and that in our side, if we have to do the lobbying, so it is like for example has been explain to you that we are straightforward like direct meeting, for example, towards the government's governments, or etc. So we are likely to build connection to build the connections better towards them, right? So this has two benefits. This has two benefits on government sides of the house. Firstly, we would likely to create a more forward and a faster change. I realize social movement at Thank you. Realize the social movement at the first place is like a group that leads people that likely to lead a people's voice. So they're supposed to do like something that will likely to catch their targets, for example. So we think that prioritizing lobbying is like more beneficial, right? Secondly, then we can gain the trust from the societies. So as for example, as we are more likely to build like fundamental approach and so on and so far. So the social justice movement on the first place will likely to be perceived as a reliable movements, etc. So in our side, it is more beneficial for the social justice movement to keep moving forward, and etc. Right? Second clash then, which one side is more important, either the reputations or the change, right? They claim to you two things. Firstly, lobbying on our side will deem radical or because we are like keep moving forwards directly, etc. Secondly, then they also told you that they need something that will catch their eyes, so that this will so that they're likely to change, right? But we told you that this is not as opposition side of the house explained to you about the radicalism, right? We have to realize that radicalism is that attack directly without even have the intentions to change or etc. But in our side, we only like having the intentions to reach out the government's officials to like influence them or having the critics to them or etc. Right? And then on the second point, then they told you that they need something that catch their eyes, but they never told you what on their side that will catch the government officials' attentions. So we don't exactly understand what they want onto their opposition side of the house, right? And exactly on our side, we already told you that in our side we are likely to do the directly movement or etc. So in our side we are likely to catch the government's attentions and etc. So we are likely to. So in our side we are so proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. I would like now to welcome the opposition. You may have the floor here.
Right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panels, these government officials who are in high positions don't just spend their time scrolling through like social media and looking at social justice movements. They are only bothered if there's a direct attack on them. And this is why it is not that easy to just get a private meeting with this high-ranking government officials. To do this, you need to actually do something big to attract their attention, right? Side proposition has to explain how their side is actually just likely to gain these meetings in the first place and why this is not more likely to happen than court proceedings, right? Now, two important clashes in my speech. Firstly, on power balance and awareness, and secondly, whether there's a necessity to have like face-to-face contact with these government officials themselves, right? To my first clash on the power balance and awareness. What does side proposition tell you, right? They told you that, that social justice movements would already have power due to the people in the first place. Now, several responses to this. First of all, know that currently the government doesn't really care about the social justice movements unless there's a direct impact on them. So this would, for example, look like the radicals there on their side that would actually directly attack or accuse these governments, or like for example, this radical action that would like rig certain things like oil rigs, right? Secondly, note that the difference on their side is that on our side is that when these judicial reviews are being done, this would actually happen in courts and not private meeting rooms. That is like only accessible to a couple of government officials and the representatives of the social movement. Look, on our side, like when this social movement, such as like feminism or like Black Lives Matter, will charge governments, then this will just generate like a lot of media attention. Look, panels, when this big social movements would say that, oh, these government actions are wrong, or like when they say that they are unfair or unbiased or biased, right? Then what is that like media networks such as, for example, TVC News or CNN would actually want to cover this live and report to the public. This means that under our side, we would actually generate more publicity on more awareness, which would just strengthen these social movements, right? Look, panels, the power of these social justice movements comes from the power of the people, their voices, etc. This is literally why social justice movements have actually succeeded in the past, because there are people who are scrutinizing the government on social media, and there will people that would like march down the streets. However, this won't actually happen on their side, because like the meetings that they would hold with these governments are going to be private. They're not going to be accessible to the right? Like media networks cannot just go into this meeting and say like, oh, can I film this? They cannot do this. Look, panels, even if side publication does actually raise awareness on their side, this is likely to be awareness that is going to be counterintuitive to their progressive movements in the first place. Panels, know that under their side, in order for them to get these private meetings in the first place, they would have to do something big like these radical actions. This is because on their side, in order to gain the government's attention in the first place, they have to do things such as, like, for example, ruining certain paintings or destroying certain properties such as oil rigs, right? Panels, at the end of the day, it is just way easier to like submit a request for a court proceeding, as this is literally literally the right of every single citizen and would be actually be very accessible at the end of the day. However, it is not that easy to actually get in contact with this like high-ranking government officials that can actually have the power and status to change these laws, right? These people are busy and they have their jobs to do. So for these reasons, side publication needs to actually prove to you why these radical actions would actually generate a lot of controversy with this public, because like a good portion of the population would actually see these social movements at parties as like a bunch of maybe rule breakers or criminals or just radicals, when on their side they just do these big actions to get the government attention. Furthermore, note that like on side publication, when they have done these radical actions, this will just put them in bad terms with the government themselves, as they have like literally broken several laws. This means that on side proposition, the government will see their representatives as this, for example, rule breakers, instead of seeing them as like well-intentioned citizens who actually wants to create change that will actually benefit society, which is what will happen under our side. Side proposition can just like point out how in the current status quo, there's already so many lobbyists, as often these people will just end up getting charged with crimes and getting tried under, and getting tried, right? Rather than getting a meeting with the government themselves. Panels, like just take a look at how many times there has been so many coverage on these people being put in jails and etc., right? So, panels, what can you conclude from this clash alone? 3 things. First of all, know that this court proceedings would actually get more media awareness than the private meetings on side proposition. Secondly, this court proceedings is just more accessible. And thirdly, note that this does not require like certain radical actions to gain the awareness of these government officials, as what will happen on the side of the house, right?
If you characterize social justice movements as radical, wouldn't it be garnering the public attention as well? If you characterize social justice movements as radical, wouldn't it be garnering public attention as well?
Yes, it would gather public awareness, but I've told you why this awareness is bad. Because, like, for example, when you look at the current status quo, how many radical actions have done? There is actually a lot of controversy surrounding these radical actions. This means that there will be people out there that just say, oh, look at this social justice movement. They just do crimes. They broke these laws. They are not actually well intentioned, and they would just harm their movement. As more people would just see these people as rule breakers and not actual people who have good intentions, right? Secondly, then, on my clash on whether there's actually a necessity to have face-to-face connection with these government officials themselves in the first place. Now, what are the claims then? They said that, oh, judicial review is indirect and government officials would actually be more incentivized to listen to people than like following a complaint given by this court, right? Several responses. First of all, note that this judicial reviews being indirect is actually a benefit and not a harm. This means that under our side, the government won't have like the final say in saying that what law is right, what action is wrong, and etc. Look, panels, if there's a problem with the government's laws and actions, and then you just go to these government officials themselves, and you just tell them that, oh, what you're doing is wrong, it is horrible, inhumane, etc. These government officials will not be likely to look at this objectively because you're literally like accusing them of committing wrongdoings. These are the government officials themselves, right? They are part of the government. Panels, let's just draw a parallel here. There's like a reason why victims don't just discuss things with like the charged person without any judges present. This is because the one who is accused of these crimes cannot be objective during these sessions. Look, under our side of the house, these judges won't be actually be personally connected to this case. They can actually judge these cases objectively at the end of the day. And know that under our side, these judges have actually done a lot of cases. They actually know how to follow the law. They know how to judge these things correctively. And under our side, we will just give you a better objective evaluation, right? On is actually wrong and whether or not the government laws are actually flawed in the first place. Look, panels, if side publications want to talk about like face-to-face connection, then note that under our side, this will also happen as like in the court, the representatives of these social movements would also make their case in the same room in front of these judges. Furthermore, note that like side publication has actually understood the power balance in society today. The cannot do whatever they want and then just make unjust laws with no checks and balances. And like one of these checks and balances are these courts themselves. Look, what will happen if the court have found that the government's laws are unjust is that they wouldn't just like file a complaint to the government as what they characterize. These courts would like literally force and demand the government to change their laws. They would say that, oh, you're unjust, you don't have total power, and you should actually change these laws, right? Now then, know that under our side, like this court proceedings would actually be more book-based, and this means that it is just likely to be more in line with the laws and etc. Right? Now then, what can you conclude from this clash? Two things. First of all, the court has actually just power over the government officials, and they have the power to make this government official enact these laws if they find it unfair. And secondly, that the government officials on their side will have some of like bias or prejudice, because on their side, you're literally saying to this government official that their laws are wrong, right? And they will probably take this not from an objective manner because of the reasons vote for position.
Thank you for that fine speech. To conclude the case of the oppositions, I would like to welcome opposition's reply. You may have the floor here.
Starting my speech in, hold up, is this audible enough? No. Okay, what about now? Okay, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. You can't go against a more powerful body in the government system and expect one government official to make change and change all of all the officials inside the parliament. Asking for a meeting from the government is not something achievable. You are treated as a commoner when you just enter the system just like that. Governments are not obligated to actually agree to meet with you in the first place. The reason why Indonesia has UUD or like Pancasila is for it to be adhered to. It is the basis of fundamental basis of like the current government system that laws and policies are actually supposed to be like in line with. They cannot accuse us of being dismissive when their whole whip engaged nothing of our DPM's case to begin with. Without a strategic mistake, two important things to note here. Firstly, they never actually proved to you why one single meeting to lobby the government is actually something that is direct. Their whole case falls if they cannot prove to you of the direct connections without radicality that actually exists under their side. Because when you are not a credible actor, your complaints will not be heard anyway on your end. Secondly, I want to point out a major contradiction in their case. Their PM said lobbying is a frontal action and it's going to be direct and simple, just like that. But then this doesn't make sense. And like their DPM actually conceded that, oh, this is you're going to have deeper connections with that government official. That's why you're going to make change and you're going to persuade them. I don't get why that is actually making sense or something that's exclusive. It's too late to clarify and reply which side is it, right? Well, there are then two important clashes in this debate. First clash, which side fulfills interests of social justice movements more? Second, awareness and the support for social justice movements. First clash then, on the interests of the social justice movements. I think more change happens under our side of the House. Policies are passed down and created better because of two things. Firstly, the interest of a greater good. Secondly, you bring it to court who has power positions above the government. You make judges and officials oversee it, so checks and balances are actually already achieved at anyway. But then I want to note that the only thing that they said about this was that negotiations is going to be more effective because you have a direct connection and like deeper connection with the government officials, which is not going to be even sustainable to begin with. But then what is their case, right? They told you that social justice movements is directly engaged with the government, and somehow even if you only persuade one single government official, it's going to be down and act upon when you just have that one party. This is not enough, panels, because of two things. Firstly, you're putting too much trust on one party from the government. Minority still loses over majority anyway, right? But then note that this is actually something that is not achievable under your side of the House. But then also note that they cannot just say that court is going to be indirect and that is bad, because like at the end of the day, that's not explained. They need to explain two things why. Why is it actually indirect under their side? What is the harm? There isn't any sufficient response that an individual government will not change anything. Please be realistic, right? How is it actually possible to just come to a government office and suddenly get a meeting? They're a busy person with other types of jobs to do. They never actually even prove why that is likely to be done anyway. People have to do demonstration processes to finally enter a government building. It's not as easy as proposition has painted to you. But then second clash, right? More awareness and support for social justice movements. What is the case? We told you media reports will be done and updates courts proceedings will be done. That's why you get more awareness. But then secondly, legal, so this means that people listen to it and it's passed on more effectively. But then I want to know that their case and response was not enough because firstly, what they do under their side of the House, these types of negotiations and lobbying is going to go unregulated, no one to oversee. But then secondly, the bargaining position still exists, which I want to note that they never actually even clarified or engaged to that point. But then thirdly, you actually just hinges upon assumption of government is going to cooperate and listen. But lastly, under the issue of trust, I want to know that that is not something that will be achieved under your set of because lobbying needs attention for the government to actually happen. This means they have to do something big to attract government change. They're more likely to do things like radicalism and things like that and violence, which is going to ruin the image of these types of social justice movements at the end of the day. For all those reasons, Jabar wins.
Thank you for that speech. Now to conclude the case of government and the whole debate, I would like to welcome Gov reply. Here.
Hello? Okay. Proposition side thinks that opposition has three major flaws. The first is that we think that they have the wrong here. First point is on what lobbying actually means. Their LO already agreed to us that lobbying is something that is indirect, that is something that is soft, that it does not mean that you're directly meshing with the system. However, the DLO then proceeded to tell you that it is posting on social media, which is completely tense because they said that it doesn't gain traction because nobody will know about it. Then suddenly you're posting hate speech on social media. Of course people will know about that. We don't think this makes any sense at all just on the framing that they take our lobbying, which means that that argument doesn't do our side any justice when they don't understand what we actually mean by lobbying, right? But then two, on the point of frontal and direct, we think it's not too late to clarify that because actually I said this at the very start of my speech, right in my opening. If I may remind you, I said that rather than meshing with systems, we would insert ourselves into those systems and influence them directly. That was what we mean from the very start with engaging and with being frontal. It's not about them in the head or anything as they might imply. But okay, second point is that opposition accuses us of playing in a very idealistic world. But we think that they commit the same crime. That all of their arguments really assume that the judicial system is perfect and all accommodating. But from the very start of my speech, I already characterized to you why bureaucracy is slow and that it doesn't accommodate and ignores the pleas of many people. If they accuse us of this, they do it so much worse, as they never tackle our points on, for example, cases being dropped, cases losing interest over time, and the massive time that is taken that necessarily means change will take longer to manifest on their side of the house. While we tell you that when you actually do get the chance to meet a person, a government official in person, there is a likelihood that that case likely to be fresh in their mind and then more likely to be implemented on our side of the house. But then 3, they accuse us of causing bad reputation for that social media when they themselves already characterize social movements as something that is radical. Logically then, that even before they did this lobbying, they were already seen as radical. So what is the difference on our side of the house? They have to rectify this. We think this debate comes down to 2 clashes. The first on the principle, i.e. the interest of social movements. 3 points here. First is that they say that every social movement has different interests. So what? Of course they have different interests. They don't prove to you why social movements having different interests from each other is necessarily a bad thing. And anyway, we told you that even with the judicial review system, they have their own self-centered views anyway. So they have not proven to you that why social movements necessarily having different ideas about certain things is a bad thing. But then 2, they talk about us about illegality and radicalism. And okay, maybe social movements do stuff like that in status quo, but we think that it's for nothing, right? Because if you weigh against the suffering of the vulnerable actors that they are trying to protect, we think that this kind of thing is completely justified, especially when it characterizes you that the system that is in place has already failed them and they never engage with this point. And then 3 is that we told you that other actors also lobby and precedent shows that it is effective. And then why we tell you this is justified for social movements to do it, because at least they're fighting for a cause that is righteous, that they're trying to protect people, other conglomerates. They also never engage at this point. Secondly, on the practical, which side gets more policy? I would just like to note that they are incredibly dismissive of our characterization of bureaucracy. They don't prove why it wouldn't be slow and accommodating, and only also mean that somehow that when your case does get to court, it'll be passed, for example, or that even gets to court in the first place, right? Where we told you why that is not the case, that case is being dropped, that there are multiple steps to be taken in comparison to lobbying, which is more direct. And furthermore, they say that inconsistency means better policies, which is also dismissive of our characterization that the government is apathetic, that they are ignorant. When has inconsistency ever stopped the government from making policies that harm people? And then 2, they only attack really some reasons for why we said the judicial issue is ineffective, as in they only attack my first point, which I guess is fair, but then we also characterize that it is open to everyone, therefore your case might not be highlighted. They have to attack that too. And also they accuse us of little bargaining power, but their side also needs bargaining power if we want to submit judicial review. This is symmetrical on both sides. The difference is that on our side, if you do get engagement with the government, then that is more likely to be implemented, because now somebody inside that who has influence over the system that is in place can help you to make those things happen. For all of those reasons, you must vote for proposition side.
Okay. Thank you for that speech. That marks the end of the debate. For all participants, please shake hands and wait to the debaters' halls immediately.
Sejak 1960, kami berupaya memberikan kontribusi bagi bangsa dalam membangun dan mencerdaskan melalui pendidikan. Universitas Ahmad Dahlan menjadi pilihan utama mewujudkan cita-cita. Setiap tahun, Tak kurang dari 7.000 mahasiswa baru dari dalam dan luar negeri bergabung bersama kami. Dengan inovasi, teknologi, dan kreativitas, serta dilandasi integritas intelektual dan integritas moral yang dijiwai nilai-nilai Islam, kami ciptakan suasana belajar yang nyaman dan menyenangkan. Kepercayaan masyarakat kepada kami dibuktikan dengan meningkatnya jumlah mahasiswa baru dari tahun ke tahun. Saat ini, lebih dari 26.000 mahasiswa aktif yang berasal dari berbagai wilayah di tanah air. Upaya internasionalisasi terus kami lakukan, ditunjukkan dengan adanya sebaran mahasiswa asing dari mancanegara. Iklim prestasi yang dibangun di lingkungan kampus mendukung mahasiswa terbaik dalam berkompetisi di berbagai kejuaraan, baik tingkat nasional maupun internasional. Kami memberikan bekal pengalaman kepada mahasiswa untuk mengikuti berbagai